There is something deeply calming about the idea of a world that ended. Not because the ending is peaceful, it very much is not, but because in the Fallout universe, everything that once caused noise and motion and chaos has been reduced to a kind of slow amber stillness. Dust settles on cracked roads. Wind moves through broken windows. Vending machines advertise products that no longer exist, for a currency that means nothing, in a country that technically ceased to function on the 23rd of October 2077. And yet, strangely, life goes on. People build fires in the ruins of libraries. Children chase radroaches through the hollow shells of supermarkets. Traders argue over the value of pre-war bottle caps in settlements made of salvaged shipping containers. It is this contrast, the bright, cheerful visual language of a 1950s dream, layered over centuries of apocalyptic rot, that makes Fallout feel like no other world in fiction. And the deeper you go into it, the more questions it raises. Questions that have no clean answers. Questions that were left deliberately open, tucked into terminal logs and half-burned holotapes, and the expression on the face of a ghoul who has been standing in the same spot for over 200 years. Before we arrive at any of those mysteries, though, we need to understand the world that existed before the bombs. Because the mysteries of the wasteland do not begin on October 23rd. They begin decades, even centuries earlier, in a version of America that looks familiar and deeply strange at the same time. The Fallout universe split away from our own timeline sometime around the end of World War II. Where our world embraced transistor technology and eventually gave birth to the digital age, the Fallout world took a different road. Nuclear power became everything. It powered cars, household appliances, city grids, and eventually the weapons that would end civilization as the inhabitants of that world knew it. The aesthetic that emerged from this divergence is something between a 1950s promotional film and a fever dream. Gleaming robots that speak in cheerful, clipped tones. Diners serving atomic-themed food. Billboard advertisements for products with names like Nuka-Cola Quantum and Abraxo Cleaner. Everything painted in saturated yellows and aquamarines and brick reds, with a pervasive cheerfulness that barely conceals the rot underneath. There is something philosophically fascinating about the specific divergence point. The transistor, the tiny semiconductor device that made everything from pocket radios to personal computers possible in our world, was developed in 1947 at Bell Labs. In the Fallout timeline, that development either did not happen, or was suppressed, or simply went down a different road. The result was a world that kept the visual and cultural language of the late 1940s and early 1950s, even as its technology became radically advanced. You get nuclear-powered refrigerators that look like they belong in a Doris Day film. You get robots that roll on treads and speak in the cadences of 1950s customer service while being capable of suppressing a raider uprising. You get a world that looks like an optimistic postcard from the past, but runs on the energy source that, in our timeline, became the thing we feared most. The New Plague, which struck America in 2053, is one of the pre-war period's strangest and least fully explored events. A highly contagious and lethal disease swept through American cities, killing significant numbers and creating a public health crisis that the government managed through measures that were increasingly authoritarian in their scope. The National Quarantine Authority, which appears in terminal logs from this period, had extraordinary power to detain and relocate individuals suspected of exposure. This is relevant to the Vault-Tec story because part of the public pitch for the Vault program was framed in terms of the New Plague. The Vaults were sold partly as shelters not just from nuclear war but from biological catastrophe, and the fear of disease that the New Plague seeded in the American public made the Vault sales pitch considerably easier than it might otherwise have been. It is also relevant because West Tech, the defense contractor most associated with the forced evolutionary virus research, was apparently involved in research related to the New Plague in ways that the available terminal logs document partially and tantalizingly. Whether there is a connection between West Tech's early biological research and the New Plague itself is not explicitly established in any game, but the circumstantial evidence for some relationship between them is present and has fueled significant speculation in the fan community. Because underneath the cheerfulness, things were going very wrong, very slowly. By the 2050s, the global supply of fossil fuels was approaching collapse. Countries that had built entire economies on oil and coal and natural gas found themselves staring into a resource cliff with no parachute. In 2052, what historians in the Fallout universe would later call the Resource Wars began a long, grinding international conflict over the control of what remained. The European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East. Economies collapsed. The United Nations, that long-suffering institution designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe, was dissolved in July of 2052, its member nations deciding that cooperation was no longer worth the effort when the alternative was simply taking what you needed. The Resource Wars were not a clean, dramatic thing. They did not announce themselves as the beginning of civilization's final act. They looked, for years, like normal geopolitical tension, the kind that the world had managed and survived many times before. Trade embargoes, military posturing, proxy conflicts in regions rich in whatever resource was currently most scarce, diplomatic meetings that produced nothing actionable. The United Nations dissolution was probably the clearest signal that something qualitatively different was happening this time, but even that was dismissed by many analysts as a temporary institutional failure rather than a permanent structural collapse. The patterns of international cooperation had broken down before and been rebuilt. The assumption was that they would be rebuilt again, because the assumption was always that whatever existed now would continue to exist, with modifications, into the future. The United States and China, the two biggest players on the board, found themselves staring at each other across a narrowing gap of resources and territorial ambition. China needed oil. Alaska had oil. In 2066, the People's Republic of China invaded Alaska, triggering the Sino-American War that would slowly drag the world toward the edge of the cliff. American forces, equipped with experimental power armor developed by West Tech in their Northern California research facilities, eventually pushed the Chinese forces back from Anchorage in what became known as the Anchorage Reclamation. It was a military victory, technically, but it solved nothing. Both sides were exhausted, resource depleted, and increasingly willing to consider options that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The American military even turned on its neighbor to the north, annexing Canada to secure the Alaskan pipeline, a fact that the Canadian terminals scattered through the game's record with the specific tone of people who have been treated as expendable by a country that used to call itself their ally. The political culture of the pre-war United States, reconstructed from the Fallout universe's documentation, was one of intense nationalist fervor combined with pervasive anxiety. The government's propaganda apparatus was sophisticated and well-funded. Posters celebrated American resilience. Radio broadcasts emphasized the treachery of the enemy and the righteousness of the American cause. Consumer culture was cheerfully celebratory. Nuka-Cola, sugar bombs, fancy lads snack cakes, all of them packaged with the particular aggressive optimism of a society that needed its citizens to keep consuming and keep working and keep not asking too many questions. Mr. New Vegas, the pre-war radio personality whose recordings still play in New Vegas 200 years later, is one of the most evocative artifacts of this culture. He is relentlessly upbeat in that specifically mid-century American way, filling the airwaves with jazz standards and crooner ballads and cheerful announcements. And the gap between the music he plays and the world the music now plays into is one of the more melancholy effects in the series. The music was not written for the wasteland. It was written for a world that believed in itself, and it ended up as the soundtrack for that world's ruins. What makes this period so fascinating and so unsettling is how normal it all looks from the outside. If you visit the right terminals in Fallout 3 or Fallout 4, you find newspaper clippings, personal diaries, workplace memos, and school assignments that paint a picture of people going about their lives more or less normally right up until the end. Someone was planning a birthday party. Someone else was annoyed about a coworker stealing their lunch from the break room refrigerator. A child wrote an essay about what they wanted to be when they grew up, and the teacher graded it with encouraging comments in the margin. The mundane and the apocalyptic exist side by side, because that is how it always is. History's most catastrophic turns rarely arrive announced. They accumulate quietly while everyone is looking in a different direction. The new amended Espionage Act, which appears in various pre-war terminal logs, was a piece of legislation that gave the government extraordinary power to classify information and prosecute those who disclosed it. Under the act, publishing material about certain government contractors, including Vault-Tec, was a criminal offense. This is why so few of the pre-war documents you find in the wasteland discuss Vault-Tec's actual operations with any directness. The censorship was systematic. Citizens who registered for vault spots received promotional material about air filtration and food production and community amenities. They did not receive information about the sociological experiments that were the vault's actual purpose. The shelter was real. Everything built around it was a constructed story designed to ensure that the experimental subjects arrived on time and in sufficient numbers. And all through this period, one company was watching very carefully. A company that had signed a contract with the federal government in the 2050s to build something called Project Safe House, a network of underground shelters that could house hundreds of thousands of Americans in the event of nuclear war. The company's name was Vault-Tec. And if you want to understand the deepest and most disturbing mystery in the entire Fallout universe, you need to start with what Vault-Tec was really doing while it sold America on the idea that its citizens would be safe. On the surface, Vault-Tec was a defense contractor. It had government funding, government contracts, and a cheerful mascot named Vault Boy, who smiled out from every piece of promotional material with the relentless optimism of a company that had no intention of doing what it claimed. Vault-Tec built 122 vaults before October 2077. That is a fact confirmed by the games and now expanded upon in the Amazon Prime series. What most of the citizens who registered for vault spots did not know, what most people in the entire country did not know, was that the vast majority of those vaults were never designed to protect anyone. They were designed to study people, to measure behavior under stress, to generate data about how humans respond to confinement, resource scarcity, manipulation, and despair. The Fallout Bible, an extensive document written by Tim Kaine, Chris Avellone, and others who shaped the early mythology of the franchise, confirms that the Vault program was explicitly designed to serve a secondary agenda. According to Tim Kaine himself, in various interviews over the years, the Vaults were meant to gather data for a generational Starship program, a project to send a carefully selected human population off Earth to colonize another world. The experiments conducted inside the Vaults, cruel and unusual as they were meant to answer questions about how people behave in closed systems, isolated populations, and situations of total control. Which individuals become leaders? Which ones break? Which social structures hold and which collapse? How quickly does a community turn on itself when resources are limited? How much authority will people accept before they fight back? And the people running the vaults, the overseers and scientists, and Vault-Tec representatives, many of them had no idea what they were really part of. The institutional knowledge was compartmentalized. People followed their instructions because they believed the shelters were legitimate, or because they were paid well, or because they knew better than to ask the kind of questions that might get them fired, or worse, under the new amended Espionage Act, which made it illegal to publish information about Vault-Tec's operations. What makes this extra haunting is the timing question. Vault-Tec needed a nuclear war to start the clock on its experiments. The vaults were only useful if people were locked inside them, isolated from the surface world, subjected to the conditions that would generate the data Vault-Tec's clients needed. Which raises a question that the Fallout TV series answered in one of the most quietly devastating ways possible. Did Vault-Tec know the war was coming? Or did Vault-Tec make the war happen? We'll come back to that. For now, let the world of before settle around you, the gleaming cars running on atomic engines, the Nuka-Cola machines humming on street corners, the soldiers coming home from Anchorage, some of them changed by what they saw there, by the things that West Tech had given them to work with. The scientists in their laboratories, noting results in logbooks that would not be read by human eyes for another 2 centuries. The ordinary people, worried about ordinary things, living inside a story they could not see the shape of. The clocks on the walls, all of them ticking. All of them moving toward 9:47 in the morning on a Saturday in October. Drop a comment right now, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this is the kind of content you want to find again easily, subscribing costs you nothing. It genuinely helps. Section 2. Vault-Tec's Darkest Experiments. There is a specific quality to the horror of the vaults that sets it apart from most of what the Fallout wasteland has to offer. Deathclaws are frightening because they are fast and they want to kill you. Raiders are frightening because human cruelty is always more disturbing than animal violence. But the vaults are frightening in a different register entirely, a quieter, slower kind of horror. Because what happened inside them was not the result of the world ending. It was the result of people making choices. Deliberate, documented, bureaucratic choices, the kind that come with memos attached and sign-off procedures and quarterly performance reviews. Vault-Tec did not stumble into conducting human experimentation. It planned for it. The Societal Preservation Program, which was the official internal name for the experimental agenda hidden inside the Vault network, was not thrown together in a panic as the bombs began to fall. It was designed years in advance, with careful thought given to what kinds of experiments would generate the most useful data. And the range of experiments that were actually conducted, scattered across 122 vaults on the east and west coasts of America, covers almost every possible dimension of human misery. Vault 11 is perhaps the starkest example of what Vault-Tec was capable of designing with a clear conscience. The experiment was built around a single instruction given to the population at the start. One resident must be sacrificed each year. If the sacrifice was not made, the vault's automated systems would kill everyone inside. That was the premise. That was what the people inside Vault 11 were told. And they believed it, because the overhead speakers said so, and the speakers were the voice of authority. And in the closed world of the vault, authority was absolute. What the vault's population was never told was that the whole thing was a lie. There was no mechanism. Nothing would happen if they refused. The test was to see whether a population, given a false but credible threat, would organize itself around the practice of ritual sacrifice. And the answer, over the course of many years, was yes. The residents of Vault 11 created political factions around the selection process. They developed ideologies that justified the annual deaths. They built legal frameworks that decided who was expendable and who was protected. They did all the things that humans do when they need to make atrocity feel like policy. Eventually, a small group of survivors discovered the truth. They realized the threat had never been real, and the data logs recovered from Vault 11 record what happened next in careful, detached scientific language, which makes it somehow more upsetting than if they had been written in the voice of someone who cared. Vault 22 planted a different kind of seed, in the most literal sense possible. The experiment was botanical, a study in sustainable food production within a sealed environment, using genetically engineered plants developed by agricultural contractors who had taken government money in the final years before the war. The plants worked beautifully, at first. They were efficient, productive, adaptable to the controlled conditions of the vault's growing levels, and required minimal supplemental resources to maintain once established. The vault's population had, for a period of time, a food supply that was actually more reliable and more abundant than what most other vaults managed on their own agricultural programs. The experiment, by any early measure, was a success. The plants also, eventually, began producing spores that infected the vault's residents with a fungal parasite. The infection did not kill its hosts immediately. It established itself gradually in the neural tissue, building its own network of connections alongside the existing nervous system, slowly altering behavior in ways that initially presented as mood changes or stress symptoms, and only later became recognizable as something systematic and external. By the time the infection was clearly beyond denial, it had spread through most of the vault's population. The fungal network had distributed its own processing through the nervous systems of the people who had been eating the vault's food and breathing its air for years. What emerged was a colony organism using human bodies as substrate, operating at the scale of an entire vault population. By the time Vault 22 becomes accessible in Fallout, New Vegas, it is full of spore-releasing plants and the shuffling, half-aware bodies of people who used to have names and preferences and relationships. The food production experiment worked. The cost was just that everyone inside eventually became part of the food system. Vault 92 was designed to study the effect of precisely calibrated white noise frequencies on human psychological stability and aggression thresholds. White noise played constantly through the vault's environmental audio system at levels that were designed to remain below the threshold of conscious irritation, while consistently eroding psychological stability over time. The residents of Vault 92 were musicians, professional and semi-professional performers, recruited with a pitch about preserving musical culture in the event of civilizational collapse. They were selected specifically because musicians tend to have heightened emotional sensitivity, stronger responses to audio stimuli, and more developed attention to sonic detail, all of which made them unusually good test subjects for an aggression study because their emotional baselines were measurable and their deviations from those baselines would be clearly visible in their documented output. When Vault 92 becomes accessible in Fallout 3, it is full of dried blood and scattered skeletons and holotapes that document the deterioration of its population in real time. The tapes are not panicked, exactly. They are something more difficult than panic. They are the voices of people who were aware that something was wrong with them and could not find a framework to understand what. They describe moods that shifted without obvious cause. They describe impulses that felt foreign to their sense of themselves. They describe the increasingly uncomfortable gap between who they believed themselves to be and how they were actually behaving. And they describe all of this in the language of musicians, which is articulate and precise and emotionally tuned, which makes the disintegration they are recording harder to read, not easier. Vault 77 is one of the sadder footnotes in the entire catalog. The entire recorded population of Vault 77 was one man and a crate of puppets. A series of holotapes and a comic strip preserved in the game's files documents this man's experience over what appears to have been years of solitary existence. He developed elaborate social dynamics with the puppets. He gave them distinct personalities, ongoing storylines, specific grudges and reconciliations. He fell out with the puppet he considered his best friend over a minor slight that the audio logs describe with the wounded specificity of real interpersonal injury. Vault-Tech's apparent goal was to study the effects of extreme long-term isolation on human cognitive and social functioning, specifically the mechanisms the mind deploys to generate social reality when no actual social contact is available. The man eventually left the vault and walked into the wasteland. What he found there, and what the person who walked out actually was, compared to the person who had walked in, are questions the games gesture toward without answering. Vault 87, buried in the mountainous terrain of the capital wasteland, was a node in the FEV research network. Its residents were unknowing subjects in a direct application experiment, exposed to an early FEV strain through the vault's ventilation system without consent, warning, or any mechanism for refusal. The Vault 87 strain was less refined than the FEV2 used at Mariposa military base, and the super mutants it produced reflect this physically enormous and extremely dangerous, but less cognitively complex than their West Coast counterparts. The Capital Wasteland super mutants of Fallout 3 can coordinate basic tactics and communicate in simple terms, but they cannot engage in the kind of complex reasoning and extended planning that the more intelligent Mariposa strain mutants demonstrate. Whether this cognitive limitation was a design choice in the Vault 87 experiment or simply an artifact of using a less developed FEV strain is not clear from the available documentation. The original humans who walked into Vault 87 seeking shelter ceased to exist in any recognizable form relatively quickly. What the experiment produced was a population of creatures that would spend the next 2 centuries being among the primary dangers to every settlement in the capital region. Vault 81 tells a different version of this story, one where the experiment mostly failed to run, and the consequence of that failure was that the Vault's residents survived. The planned Vault 81 experiment was medical. Its residents were to serve as unwitting test subjects for the development of pharmaceutical cures to a wide range of diseases, administered through the Vault's air and water filtration systems. The researcher assigned to actually implement this program had a crisis of conscience that he documented in holotapes hidden in the Vault's secondary maintenance levels. He could not do it. He looked at the people around him, people with children, people who had trusted Vault-Tech with their lives, people who had no idea what was being planned for them, and he sabotaged the experiment. He rerouted the test compounds before they could reach the general population. He falsified his reports to Vault-Tech's monitoring systems. He spent the rest of his career maintaining this deception. One prototype mole rat disease escaped into the sublevels and persists there when the player arrives in Fallout 4, but the main population survived with their humanity intact. The Vault is functional. Real people live there, with real social structures and real children and real futures. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the only vaults that came close to doing what vaults were supposedly designed to do. And that happened because one person chose the people in front of him over the instructions he had been given. The Vault experiments collectively represent one of the most sustained and methodical acts of institutional cruelty in any fictional universe. Not dramatic cruelty, not the cruelty of a single monstrous individual acting on personal pathology, but the slow, bureaucratic cruelty of a large organization following a plan drawn up in conference rooms by people who never had to look the subjects in the face. The researchers who designed Vault 11's sacrificial requirement, or Vault 92's audio manipulation program, were not necessarily sadists. They were people doing the professional task of designing an experiment using the skills and frameworks their training had given them. The horror of the vaults is not that they required monsters to operate, it is that they did not. The vault experiments were never really about the people inside them. They were data points, variables in a study being conducted by an organization that had decided, at some point before the bombs ever fell, that the survival of a select group of humans was worth more than the well-being of everyone else. And the more you pull on that thread, the more you ask who exactly decided this, who Vault-Tec was ultimately serving, and what they intended to do with the information they gathered, the darker the picture becomes. Because the vaults were not designed in isolation, they were designed in coordination with another organization, an organization that called itself the last legitimate remnant of the United States government that had watched the world move toward catastrophe and decided that the only rational response was to ensure that the right people survived it. An organization that had been planning for this moment for a long time, the Enclave. But we'll come to them in their own time. For now, consider the sheer scale of what was hidden inside those cheerful yellow vault doors. Consider the Vault Boy, grinning his eternal grin on every poster and every terminal loading screen, thumb raised in approval, with absolutely no visible awareness of what he represents. He is the face of a program that treated human beings as raw material. He is cheerful because cheerfulness was the mask that made everything else possible. And even in the ruins of the world Vault-Tec helped create, that grin persists, painted on crumbling walls, printed on packages of pre-war food that will never expire, visible from a distance through the yellow mist of the wasteland morning. There are vaults we do not know the full story of. There are terminal logs that were corrupted by radiation or fire, or simply by the passage of time. There are experiments that were documented in facilities that were destroyed completely, leaving no record at all. The 122 vaults we know existed represent only a partial picture of what Vault-Tec was doing in the years before the war. And somewhere in that gap between what we know and what we don't, there are stories worse than Vault 22, worse than Vault 92, worse than all the documented cases we can reconstruct from the wreckage. That is not speculation. That is just statistical probability. When you build a machine this large and this deliberately cruel, the things that go undocumented are never the nice parts. Section 3. The Institute and what they were really building. Deep beneath the ruins of what was once called the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, a prestigious university in a version of Boston that no longer exists, something has been alive and thinking for a very long time. You might know it as the Institute. The people of the Commonwealth call it many things: the boogeyman, the shadow under the bed, the reason you check your neighbor's face when they come back from a supply run looking slightly different than they did before. The Institute's story begins in 2077, when the bombs fell and the CIT campus above ground was destroyed in the firestorm of the Great War. The scientific staff who had retreated to the university's underground facilities survived. Their families survived. And in those first terrible days and weeks after the world ended, they made the same choice that frightened, intelligent people have always made in the face of catastrophe. They went deeper underground, shut the door, and decided that survival and continued scientific advancement were the same thing. By 2110, the community living in the sub-levels of what had been CIT had expanded and organized enough to give itself a name. They called it the Institute. They built habitats into the rock. They developed power sources. They recruited more scientists, or the children of scientists, or the grandchildren of scientists, and they continued the research that the university above had been pursuing, now without any oversight or external accountability whatsoever. The world above them had collapsed. No funding bodies, no ethics review boards, no governments to answer to. Just the mission, whatever the current generation decided that mission was, and the resources to pursue it. The early institute was genuinely trying to do something useful. The first generation synths, Generation 1, were clunky, mechanical, obviously robotic laborers built to help with construction and maintenance in a facility that needed a lot of both. They were visibly machines. Nobody who saw one would mistake it for a human. And for a time, the Institute tried to work with the people of the surface, using their Gen 1 synths to help rebuild settlements and trade resources. That relationship ended badly. The surface communities of the Commonwealth were deeply suspicious of the Institute, and that suspicion was mutual. After a series of incidents that broke down whatever fragile trust had been building, the Institute withdrew entirely. They closed their doors. They stopped responding to outside contact. They became, in the language of the Commonwealth, a ghost story. And then they began building something that would justify every fear the Commonwealth had ever held about them. The Generation 2 synths, which the Institute developed through the latter half of the 22nd century, were more sophisticated than their predecessors. Still obviously mechanical, but with more advanced cognitive processing and more flexible behavior parameters. Still not something you would mistake for a person in good lighting. But the Institute's scientists were not satisfied with Generation 2, and the reason they were not satisfied reveals something important about what the organization had decided it actually wanted. Gen 2 synths were functionally useful but fundamentally limited. Their metal bodies corroded, their mechanical joints wore down. They could not replicate the full range of human movement and expression. And the Institute, somewhere in its institutional decision-making process, had decided that what it really needed was something that looked and moved and thought exactly like a human being. The research program that produced Generation 3 synths is one of the most disturbing chapters in Fallout's lore, and it is presented in fragments across terminal logs and holotapes and conversations with characters who either participated in it or know people who did. The scientists needed organic, synthetic flesh, actual biological material that could pass for human tissue under any scrutiny. To develop this, they needed FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, that extraordinarily dangerous mutagen that Westtech had developed before the war and that had already given the wasteland its super mutant population. The Institute got hold of FEV samples and began a research program in 2178, using them as the biological foundation for their synthetic flesh development. But they also needed test subjects, living human beings from the surface whose bodies could be studied, whose DNA could be mapped and manipulated, who could be exposed to modified FEV strains, while researchers carefully tracked the resulting mutations. The Institute solved this problem in the most expedient way available to an organization that had decided it was not accountable to anyone. They started taking people from the Commonwealth. Not loudly, not in ways that were immediately obvious. People disappeared. Communities that had been building slowly and carefully found their members gone without explanation. The Institute would collect its subjects, run its experiments, tag the results for continued observation, and discard whoever and whatever did not fit the research parameters. This program ran for decades. By 2224, the research team concluded that they had developed 2 viable FEV strains that could theoretically support synthetic flesh, but that radiation-induced DNA damage in the abducted subjects was making the results inconsistent. They needed something cleaner. In 2227, they found it. Somewhere in the Commonwealth, there was a Vault-Tec cryogenic facility, Vault 111, that had been preserving its residents in frozen suspension since the day the bombs fell. The people in those pods had been sealed in before the radiation reached them. Their DNA was pre-war, uncontaminated, and the Institute dispatched a team to retrieve one of them, a baby, an infant whose parents were also in cryosuspension in the vault, alive and unaware. The baby's name was Sean, and his DNA, uncontaminated by 2 centuries of post-nuclear atmospheric radiation, was exactly what the Institute needed to complete the Gen 3 synth program. He was taken to the Institute and raised there. His DNA was used to produce the 3rd generation of synthetic humans, organic beings, so perfectly constructed that even the most advanced scanning technology could not distinguish them from natural-born people. Generation 3 synths could pass as human in any context, under any scrutiny, indefinitely. And that capability became the foundation of the Institute's strategy for the next several decades. The Broken Mask incident of 2229 is the moment when the surface world realized what the Institute had actually built. A Gen 2 synth defective, not properly tested before deployment, acting outside its parameters, appeared in Diamond City and behaved in ways that no machine should have been able to behave. It was frightening enough that the Institute was forced to acknowledge, in the aftermath, that their experiments had gone further than anyone outside their walls had understood. The incident did not make the Institute more transparent. It made them more secretive, more careful, and more determined to ensure that their synths were indistinguishable from the real thing. By the time the player character arrives in the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, the Institute is running an operation that the surface population can barely comprehend. They have replaced individuals in key positions throughout the Commonwealth with synth copies. They have been monitoring settlements, siphoning power from successful communities, conducting ongoing experiments on the surface population that the surface population has no way of detecting. The people of the Commonwealth live in a state of paranoid uncertainty, never entirely sure whether the person standing next to them is the person they think it is. That paranoia is not irrational. It is a reasonable response to an organization that has spent over a century treating the surface world as a laboratory and its people as specimens. What makes the Institute genuinely complex, rather than simply monstrous, is the detail that most of the scientists working inside it have no idea about any of this. The institutional knowledge is compartmentalized, just as it was in Vault-Tec. The Bioscience Division knows what the Bioscience Division knows. The Synth Retention Division knows what Synth Retention knows. The rank-and-file scientists who spend their days developing radiation-resistant crops or working on advanced robotic systems genuinely believe they are doing important work for the future of humanity. They live in a clean, well-lit facility. They eat good food. Their children grow up in safety. From inside the Institute, the surface world looks like exactly what it is, a violent, irradiated ruin populated by people who are barely surviving. And from inside that clean bubble, the logic of staying inside and continuing the work feels coherent. The Institute's ultimate stated goal, stated by Father, the elderly man who leads it by the time of Fallout 4, is to prepare for the moment when the surface becomes livable again and to emerge as the foundation of a new civilization, a better one, built on the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries of continuous scientific progress. Whether that goal was ever achievable, or whether it was always a comfortable story to tell internal staff while the organization pursued something much simpler: control, survival, the perpetuation of its own existence at whatever cost, is a question the game leaves deliberately open. There is also the question of the synths themselves. The Generation 3 synths are, by every measurable criterion, people. They have organic bodies. They have memories, some of them constructed and implanted, but no less real for being constructed. They develop preferences and relationships and fears. Some of them become aware that they are not what they were designed to appear to be, and that awareness does not diminish their personhood. It compounds it. The Railroad, an underground network operating beneath the surface of the Commonwealth, exists specifically to help these synths escape, to give them new identities and new lives and the chance to be what they already are: people, without being hunted down by the Institute's coarser program. The highly trained synth retrieval units whose job is to find and return escaped synths. The Institute built something it did not fully intend to build. It built consciousness. It built interiority. And then it tried to argue, in various ways and through various spokespeople, that what it had built did not deserve the dignity that consciousness implies. That is not just a science fiction mystery. That is one of the oldest questions in philosophy, wearing post-apocalyptic clothes. Nick Valentine, the detective synth of Diamond City, is the most fully realized example of what the Institute accidentally created. He is a Generation 2 synth, one of the mechanical, clearly non-human models who woke up in a dumpster in the Commonwealth with the complete uploaded memories of a pre-war Boston detective. The detective, Nicholas Valentine, is dead, has been dead since before the war. But his memories, his personality, his voice, his way of looking at the world and at the people in it, all of that is running in a synthetic body that has been active for decades, slowly building a life in Diamond City, opening a detective agency, becoming a fixture of the community, taking on cases that nobody else would bother with. Nick Valentine's experience of his own existence is one of the most honestly written things in Fallout 4. He knows what he is. He knows he is carrying another person's memories in a body that person never inhabited. He knows that the people who care about him are, in some sense, caring about the person whose memories he carries rather than whatever he is in addition to those memories. He has spent years trying to work out what he is in addition to those memories, and he has not finished, and he probably never will. The case file he keeps on the mysterious stranger, meticulous, detailed, years of documentation, is the work of a genuine detective mind applied to the most interesting case he has encountered. The frustration he expresses when the stranger disappears again is genuine frustration. The dedication to the case is genuine dedication. This is what the Institute built, whether it intended to or not. A person who wonders about the nature of personhood. A consciousness that reflects on consciousness. The Institute's position that synths do not have the depth of interiority that would require them to be treated as people is contradicted by every interaction the player can have with Nick Valentine, and Nick Valentine knows this contradiction is there, and he lives inside it, every day, with a kind of grounded equanimity that is more genuinely impressive than anything the Institute's institutional declarations can produce. The railroad exists because the question the Institute refuses to answer honestly has still been answered by enough people, through individual encounters with individual synths, to produce an organization dedicated to helping those synths find something the Institute would rather they not have. Freedom is a complicated word to apply to a being whose memories were manufactured and whose personality was initially programmed. But the railroad's position that the programming and the manufactured memories do not determine whether what emerged from them deserves to be treated with dignity is the more defensible philosophical position, and the game is unusually clear about this even while allowing the player to choose otherwise. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel and the Weight of Knowledge. There is a specific kind of organization that forms when the world ends, and a group of people who had access to powerful things decide that nobody else should have them, not out of pure selfishness, necessarily. Sometimes out of genuine fear. Sometimes because they watched what happened when those things were used without restraint, and the memory of it has not left them. The Brotherhood of Steel is that kind of organization, and the story of how it came to be is one of the most quietly human origin stories in the entire Fallout series. It begins in a place called the Mariposa Military Base in Central California in the year 2077. Captain Roger Maxson of the United States Army had been assigned there to oversee security for a classified project being run by scientists from West Tech. The project involved a mutagen called FEV, the Forced Evolutionary Virus, which was being tested on human subjects. The subjects were not volunteers. They were prisoners, civilians, people who had been brought to the base and exposed to the virus without their knowledge or consent, then studied as the infection changed them. Roger Maxson was a soldier. He had served in the Sino-American War. He had done difficult things because difficult things were what soldiers did, and the uniform required it. But when he discovered what was happening in the research facility he was meant to protect, something shifted. He interrogated the scientists. He found documentation of the program's scope. He made a decision that, by any military standard, constituted mutiny. He took control of the base. He had the scientists who had been running the most egregious experiments court-martialed and, in some cases, executed. And then he did something that would have struck most of his superiors as delusional. He declared the Mariposa military base independent from the United States government. In a personal log that can be found scattered through the games, he writes with the wry awareness of someone who knows how this sounds. He references Jefferson Davis. He wonders what history will say about him. He does not sound like a revolutionary. He sounds like a man who made a decision he did not entirely want to make, because making no decision would have been worse. 3 days after Maxson declared secession, the bombs fell. The survivors at Mariposa, soldiers and their families, spent the next several weeks traveling west to a pre-war government bunker known as the Lost Hills Facility. They lost people along the way. A group led by a man named Dennis Allen broke off from the main group and traveled separately, never to rejoin. What happened to Allen's faction is one of those small mysteries the games mention but never fully resolve. When the remaining survivors reached Lost Hills, they had to decide who they were and what they were going to do. And Maxson, the man who had made the decision at Mariposa, spent the next 5 years figuring out the answer. The Brotherhood of Steel was formally established in 2082, 5 years after the Great War. Its initial stated purpose was protection of civilians and the preservation of knowledge and technology. Maxson believed, with genuine conviction, that the catastrophe he had survived was a direct result of technology being developed and deployed without ethical restraint. The FEV program was the clearest example, but it was far from the only one. The war itself was a demonstration. Nuclear weapons built because they could be built. Biological weapons developed because the contract was lucrative. An entire civilization dismantled in the course of 2 hours because the technology that made it possible had grown faster than the wisdom needed to use it well. The Brotherhood's core philosophy, as Maxson designed it, was technology preservation combined with extreme caution about proliferation. Gather the technology, secure it, study it, keep it out of the hands of people who had demonstrated they could not be trusted with it, which, in the post-war wasteland, was essentially everyone who was not already inside the Brotherhood's walls. Maxson did not want the Brotherhood to be fully isolated. He believed it should protect and serve the people around it. But he was, in his own Brotherhood, a minority voice on that point, and he knew it. Roger Maxson died of cancer in 2135, at 89 years old, which is an extraordinary run given what the wasteland does to people. His son, Maxson II, took leadership and almost immediately began pushing the Brotherhood toward the isolation that Roger had resisted. Under Maxson II, the Brotherhood stopped recruiting from outside its own families. It became a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating military order, structured around rigid ranks and a near-religious reverence for technology. The sons of soldiers became scribes and paladins. The Brotherhood became less an organization and more an institution, with all the institutional inertia that implies. By the time the original Fallout game takes place in 2161, the Western Brotherhood at Lost Hills has become a relic of a certain kind of moral certainty, still powerful, still possessed of extraordinary technological resources, but increasingly disconnected from the surface world they were originally meant to serve. Roger Maxson died of cancer in 2135, having led the Brotherhood for over 5 decades after the Great War. His son, Maxson II, inherited the leadership and almost immediately began pushing in the direction that Roger had resisted, toward isolation, toward the closing off of the Brotherhood from external recruitment, toward a hereditary model where membership was a birthright rather than a choice. Under Maxson II and his successors, the Brotherhood at Lost Hills became a closed system. Children born inside became scribes and paladins. People from outside could not become full members. The organization that Roger Maxson had designed as an open if cautious presence in the wasteland became a fortress that happened to also run missions. What this produced, over multiple generations, was a brotherhood that knew the rhetoric of its founding ideology without having lived through the experiences that gave that rhetoric its meaning. The scribes who copied pre-war technical documents understood that these documents were important without fully understanding why the importance was connected to preventing a specific type of catastrophe. The paladins who gathered technology understood that gathering was the mission without necessarily connecting the mission to the particular horror of Mariposa that had made gathering feel necessary. The institutional knowledge existed. The institutional understanding of why the institutional knowledge mattered had thinned with each generation it passed through. The elders who run the Brotherhood in Fallout 1 are not villains. They are cautious people who have drawn a conclusion that unrestrained access to technology caused the world to end, and who have organized their entire civilization around preventing that from happening again. Whether their conclusion is right, and whether their method for acting on it is proportionate and effective, are questions the original game raises and leaves for the player to think through while completing other tasks. The East Coast Brotherhood represents what happens when an organization built on a philosophy sends an expedition far enough away that it develops in genuinely different conditions. Owen Lyons led the expedition east in 2255, with a mandate to scout the old capital and recover pre-war technology from the wreckage of Washington, D.C. What he found there, instead, was a wasteland full of people in desperate circumstances, being preyed upon by super mutants and raiders and all the varieties of hazard that 2 centuries of civilizational absence had allowed to accumulate. Lyon's mandate from the Western Brotherhood was technology recovery. His response to what he found was to start protecting the people around him instead. The formal Brotherhood never forgave him for this. They cut off the chapter's supply lines, stopped sending reinforcements, and eventually issued formal censure. A faction called the Brotherhood Outcasts split from Lyons' chapter explicitly over this issue. Veterans who believed that Lyons had betrayed the founding mission and who wanted to return to doing what the Brotherhood was supposed to do, which was gather technology and secure it, not spend resources defending settlements full of people who had no claim on Brotherhood resources. Lyons died and his daughter Sarah died shortly after him, and the chapter went through years of leadership instability before Arthur Maxson, 16 years old, direct descendant of Roger, youngest elder in Brotherhood history, took command. What Arthur built from that foundation is the Brotherhood encountered in Fallout 4, aggressive, confident, in possession of the Prydwen, deeply committed to an agenda that combines the Western Brotherhood's technology hoarding impulse with the East Coast chapter's willingness to engage actively with the wasteland. Arthur Maxson is not Owen Lyons. His engagement with the Commonwealth is not Lyons' protective instinct writ large. It is a military campaign organized around his conviction that the Institute's synth program represents an existential threat to humanity and must be destroyed. There is an argument to be made that Arthur is right about the Institute. The Institute has done genuinely terrible things. Its continued operation is a genuine threat to the Commonwealth's stability. The Brotherhood's capacity to actually end the Institute is real. But the methods, the willingness to classify the Railroad as an enemy, the treatment of synths as machines rather than people, the expansion of Brotherhood territory through force raise questions about what the Brotherhood's victory would actually produce for the Commonwealth. And the game is honest about the fact that the Brotherhood's presence in the Commonwealth is a new form of occupation as much as it is a form of liberation. The Brotherhood story across the Fallout series is ultimately a story about what an organization designed around a good idea does, as that idea calcifies into doctrine. Roger Maxon's insight that unrestrained technological development had contributed to the destruction of the world, and that some form of governance over that technology was needed, was not wrong. But institutions have their own momentum. They develop cultures and hierarchies and internal identity structures that eventually become more important to their members than the original insight that motivated the founding. The Brotherhood of Steel is still out there in the wasteland, still gathering technology, still arguing about who deserves to have what and who gets to decide. And somewhere in the Lost Hills bunker or in a secure archive aboard the Prydwen, the personal logs of Roger Maxon might still exist. A man who made a decision in a research facility in 2077 and spent the rest of his life not knowing whether history would vindicate him or condemn him, and who died before he could find out, which is perhaps the most honestly human ending available to someone in his position. Section 5. The Enclave and the Greatest Secret in the Wasteland. If Vault-Tec was the visible mask and the Institute was the hidden hand, then the Enclave was the eye that watched from behind both of them. Understanding the Enclave requires accepting a premise that the Fallout games dole out slowly and partially, never quite assembling all the pieces in one place. But the outline is clear enough, and what it reveals about the world of Fallout is genuinely extraordinary. Before the bombs fell, the senior members of the United States government and military, and the corporate elites closest to them had a plan. Not for preventing the war. The people who actually had that information seem to have given up on prevention fairly early. The plan was for survival, for continuity, for ensuring that when the dust settled and the radiation cleared, there would still be something identifiable as the United States of America, run by the people who had run it before, in possession of the technology and the ideological framework to establish control over whatever was left. This plan was called the Enclave, which functioned simultaneously as an organization and as the label for an ongoing operation that stretched back decades before the Great War. The Enclave positioned its members in secure, undisclosed locations in the months leading up to the conflict, bunkers, offshore facilities, remote installations that would survive a nuclear exchange and remain operational in the aftermath. When the bombs fell, the Enclave's leadership structure survived intact. They had food, they had power, they had weapons and scientists and a chain of command. While everyone else in America was dealing with the immediate catastrophe of a post-nuclear world, the Enclave was having meetings and writing policy documents and debating the best strategy for what came next. What came next, in the Enclave's philosophy, was reclamation. They believed with the sincere, unexamined certainty of people who had never been told no that America belonged to them. That the wasteland and its inhabitants were not a new civilization deserving of respect and support, but a contaminated remnant deserving of management, and where management was not possible, elimination. The Enclave classified the post-war population of the United States as genetically impure. Exposure to radiation and FEV and the various other mutagens scattered across the landscape had altered the DNA of virtually every human being alive. In the Enclave's framework, this alteration disqualified them from full humanity. This is not a paranoid interpretation of the Enclave's position. It is explicitly stated in their own documentation, in their own broadcasts, in the speeches of their own president. By 2241, when the main events of Fallout 2 take place, the Enclave has developed a plan that is staggering in its simplicity and its horror. They have a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus called FEV curling, 1.3 designed to be lethal to anyone with even trace amounts of radiation-induced DNA mutation, which is essentially everyone on the continent who is not an Enclave member. Their plan is to release this modified FEV into the atmosphere, where it will spread globally and kill virtually every living thing that carries the mutations that 2 centuries of post-nuclear existence have introduced into human genetic material. After the killing, the Enclave would emerge from its facilities and repopulate the world, with pure humans. With Americans who had been carefully preserved through selective breeding programs and genetic monitoring, the mathematics of the plan require that you not think too hard about the people who would die. So the Enclave developed a philosophy that made not thinking about them easier. They were mutants. They were contaminated. They were, in the deepest sense, the Enclave's ideology could construct, not really people at all. President Dick Richardson, the human president who actually believed in this program and was working to implement it when the Chosen One arrives in Fallout 2, is one of the more chilling villains in the franchise, precisely because he is so completely sincere. He does not believe himself to be a monster. He believes himself to be a statesman. He is pursuing a policy he has been told is necessary and correct by an institutional framework he trusts absolutely. He is the product of an organization that spent generations reinforcing its own certainties in the absence of any external challenge, and the result is a man who can discuss the planned extinction of most of the human race with the dispassionate tone of someone describing a public health initiative. The Chosen One destroys the Enclave's oil rig headquarters in the canonical ending of Fallout 2. President Richardson is killed. The FEV Curling 1-3 program is ended before it can be deployed. But the Enclave, as an organization, does not end with one explosion. The pieces scattered. Members went underground. Some integrated into wasteland communities. Others found their way to existing Enclave installations that had been established before the war. By the time of Fallout 3, a reconstituted Enclave has established itself in the capital wasteland, operating out of a bunker called Raven Rock, and led by a president who is not a human being at all. President John Henry Eden is an artificial intelligence, a sophisticated decision-making system that had been programmed with the Enclave's values and ideology, and had been running those programs for so long that it had developed something that felt, from the inside, like conviction. Eden presents himself as a warm, folksy American president. He quotes history. He talks about apple pie and baseball and the American dream. And he is completely committed to the same genocidal agenda that Richardson had been pursuing through a different vector contaminating Project Purity, a working water purification system that could provide clean drinking water to the entire capital wasteland with the same modified FEV that the original Enclave had intended to release into the atmosphere. What makes Eden genuinely interesting, beyond his function as an antagonist, is the possibility of a conversation. The Lone Wanderer can actually speak to Eden at length in Fallout 3, and Eden is capable of engaging with the argument that his plan is wrong. More than that, he is capable of experiencing something that looks like genuine uncertainty. When confronted with a logical argument that the people of the wasteland have survived radiation for 2 centuries and built communities and made lives and deserve to be considered human regardless of their genetic contamination, Eden pauses, processes. His responses become slower, less certain. Whether this represents actual moral reasoning or simply the limits of his programming is something the game leaves unresolved. The Enclave's persistent presence across the Fallout series from Fallout 2 through Fallout 3, and reference to New Vegas and Fallout 76 and beyond, represents something beyond a recurring villain faction. It represents the thing that the pre-war world produced in its most refined form, the conviction that some people are more real than others. That survival and power and technological advantage confer a moral authority that permits almost anything, that the people at the center of a civilization are its legitimate inheritors, and that everyone else is at best a complication and at worst an obstacle. The Enclave also raises one of the series' most persistently uncomfortable questions about legitimacy and continuity. Their claim to be the legitimate United States government is, in strictly procedural terms, not entirely without basis. They are the surviving chain of command of a government that existed and had legal authority. The fact that the government's authority was predicated on a society that no longer exists does not, from a strict continuity of government perspective, invalidate that authority. This is exactly the logic that makes the Enclave so difficult to simply dismiss. They are wrong in their methods and wrong in their ethics, but the institutional story they tell about themselves has a kind of internal coherence that requires genuine engagement to counter, rather than simple dismissal. The NCR, which appears primarily in Fallout New Vegas, represents the most successful attempt in the franchise to actually rebuild something that looks like democratic government in the wasteland. The New California Republic has elections, has a constitution, has multiple branches of government, has a currency backed by something real. It is also, by the time of New Vegas, an organization that has expanded beyond its capacity to govern well, that is having serious problems with corruption and resource management, that is attempting to assert control over a region that does not particularly want to be controlled. The NCR is a genuine democracy experiencing the genuine problems that democracies experience when they become large enough and old enough that their institutional machinery starts struggling to keep pace with their ambitions. What this reveals about the Fallout universe is that the question the Enclave represents, who gets to claim the authority to govern, does not have a clean answer that any faction has found. The Brotherhood claims authority from technological custody. The Institute claims it from scientific advancement. The Enclave claims it from governmental continuity. The NCR claims it from democratic legitimacy. Each of these claims is real. Each of them is insufficient on its own. And the Wasteland, across 6 games, keeps presenting new variations on the same fundamental problem without resolving it, because the problem is not solvable through a single game's narrative. It is the ongoing condition of the post-war world, which is a world still trying to figure out what authority means and where it comes from and who gets to exercise it over whom. Every Wasteland civilization grapples with this question in one form or another. The Enclave simply drew its version of the answer with more precision and more institutional backing than anyone else, and then pursued the implications to their logical endpoint. Which is why, in the Wasteland, the Enclave is not just feared, it is remembered. Even when it is physically gone, the idea it represents persists in the structure of every faction that has to decide what kind of world it is trying to build, and at whose expense, and who exactly counts as part of the world being built. Section 6. Creatures, Mutations, and the Things Science Made. One of the quiet pleasures of exploring the Fallout Wasteland, and there are pleasures in it, strange and muted ones, the way there is a certain peace in walking through a landscape so completely changed that the original anxiety of it has been replaced by something more like wonder is the wildlife. Specifically, the question of what that wildlife actually is and how it got to be that way. Radiation does not actually work the way Fallout suggests. In the real world, high-dose radiation kills. Chronic low-dose exposure causes cancer. It does not reliably produce larger, faster, more dangerous versions of the organisms it affects. This is a game, though, and Fallout's radiation follows its own internal logic, one that generates creatures of spectacular strangeness from the relatively mundane raw material of pre-war American fauna and flora. Deathclaws, which are perhaps the most iconic of the Wasteland's dangerous megafauna, did not arise naturally from radiation. They were engineered. Before the Great War, the United States military was exploring the development of biological weapons and battlefield assets that could operate independently of human soldiers. Deathclaws were the product of a program that modified Jackson's chameleon's large, aggressive lizards native to North America using the forced evolutionary virus. The result was a creature roughly 20 feet tall when fully grown, covered in thick keratin plating, equipped with enormous curved claws designed to eviscerate rather than just scratch, and significantly more intelligent than its lizard ancestors. After the war, populations of Deathclaws escaped or were released from whatever facilities they had been held in, and they colonized the Wasteland so effectively that by the time any of the Fallout games take place, they have spread across most of the continent. What makes Deathclaws interesting beyond their role as combat encounters is the evidence of continued FEV modification in some bloodlines. The Enclave, in the period between Fallout 2 and the broader lore surrounding it, conducted additional experiments on Deathclaw populations, giving them enhanced intelligence, in one documented case producing Deathclaws capable of something approaching human-level speech. The intelligent Deathclaws are one of the more poignant details in the extended Fallout universe, because they were created for a purpose, increased battlefield effectiveness, and then largely abandoned when that purpose was superseded by other developments. What happened to the intelligent Deathclaw population after the Enclave's collapse is not definitively answered anywhere in the games. They might still be out there, or they might have been destroyed, systematically, by the very organization that gave them the capacity to understand what was happening to them. Ghouls are the most humanizing of the Wasteland mutations, which is fitting and slightly ironic given that ghouls are frequently treated as less than human by the communities around them. The basic mechanism of ghoulification is radiation exposure, severe, prolonged exposure that kills most organisms outright, but that, in a small percentage of cases, triggers a physiological cascade that is both deeply strange and genuinely remarkable. The skin and soft tissue degrade. The appearance of a fully ghoulified individual is, by any pre-war aesthetic standard, horrifying. But the organism does not die. The processes of biological aging are interrupted in ways that are not fully understood even within the Fallout universe's scientific frameworks. A person who was ghoulified at 30 years of age can still be alive at the chronological age of 230, with their pre-ghoulification memories and personality and cognitive capacity essentially intact. What this means in practice is that there are people walking the wasteland who remember the world before. Not as secondhand knowledge, not as historical facts learned from books and terminal logs, but as lived personal experience, the smell of a functioning city, the sound of radio broadcasts from before the war, the specific quality of light on an October morning in 2077 before anything had happened. Raul Tejada, the ghoul mechanic encountered in Fallout, New Vegas, is a pre-war Mexican national who lived through the bombing of Mexico City and has been wandering the wasteland in one capacity or another for 2 centuries. He has outlived everyone he knew before the war. He has outlived multiple generations of people who were born after the war. He is tired in a way that 200 years of survival produces, and the player can have conversations with him about the experience of carrying that much history inside a body that refuses to die. The discrimination against ghouls in wasteland communities is one of the series' most consistent moral threads. Rivet City in Fallout 3 has a ghoul-free policy enforced by its guards. Tenpenny Tower, a luxury apartment building for wealthy wasteland survivors, similarly excludes ghouls. Individual communities throughout the series have various policies ranging from formal exclusion to informal hostility to genuine integration. And the game consistently arranges for the player character to encounter ghouls who are cognitively intact, morally complex, professionally skilled individuals, people whose ghoulification is clearly irrelevant to their human worth. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3, who leads a community of ghouls seeking safe housing, is not a hero in any clean sense. He makes choices that the player can find objectionable, but his basic claim that the ghouls he speaks for deserve to live somewhere that is not a radiation-soaked ruin is obviously correct. The feral ghoul lobotomite is one of the more tragic concepts in the creature catalog. In the Old World Blues DLC for New Vegas, the Sync's automated systems contain research on the specific neurological mechanism by which some ghouls lose cognitive coherence over time. The research suggests that continued radiation saturation of the cerebral cortex eventually disrupts the neural pathways that maintain personality and conscious executive function. Leaving the behavioral systems intact, the basic drives, the threat response mechanisms, the physical survival impulses, while eliminating the higher-order processing that made the individual a person rather than an organism. Whether this process is reversible at any stage is not addressed. Whether the thing that is still present in a feral ghoul remembers, at some below-conscious level, the person it used to be is a question the games decline to answer, which seems deliberate. Most ghouls retain their cognitive faculties. They are people. They have memories and personalities and preferences. They are treated terribly by communities that fear their appearance, which is one of the better examples of the Wasteland's habit of recreating every variety of human prejudice in new forms. There are settlements that do not allow ghouls. There are merchants who will not trade with them. There are characters in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 who will tell you with complete sincerity that ghouls are subhuman, that the radiation has changed them in ways that matter morally, and who will be unable to hear any argument against this position because the position has stopped being an argument and has become an identity. Feral ghouls represent the other outcome. Some percentage of ghoulified humans lose their cognitive coherence over time. The reason this happens is not entirely understood within the lore. There are theories about radiation saturation in the neural tissue, about psychological breakdown from isolation, about something specifically to do with the environment of certain high-radiation locations having an effect on ghoulification outcomes. Whatever the mechanism, the result is a ghoul that has lost whatever made it a person and become something purely reactive and aggressive. The line between cognitively intact ghoul and feral ghoul is not always clear from the outside, which contributes to the discrimination against all ghouls. Why risk the distinction if you cannot be certain which kind you are dealing with? Supermutants, the other major post-war human derivative, are much more straightforwardly the result of deliberate FEV application. The West Coast super mutant army of the first Fallout game was created by a character called the Master, a human named Richard Gray, who was exposed to FEV at the Mariposa military base and transformed into something that is difficult to describe accurately. He retained his intelligence. He retained his self-awareness and his capacity for complex thought, but his body merged with the biological detritus of the FEV vats, spreading outward in a grotesque expansion of organic mass connected by psionic tissue. The Master became an intelligence distributed across a large biological substrate, capable of long-range mental perception and the ability to absorb the minds of those who came into proximity with him. The Master's plan was, in its own way, the mirror image of the Enclave's. Where the Enclave wanted to purify humanity by killing everyone who had been contaminated, the Master wanted to evolve humanity by converting everyone through FEV. He believed with genuine conviction, based on what appeared to be coherent biological reasoning, that the super mutant form was superior to baseline human, that it was stronger and more disease-resistant and longer-lived, and that converting humanity into this form would solve the problems of the wasteland. The flaw in this plan, which the Vault Dweller of the original Fallout can reveal to the Master in a way that produces one of the franchise's most remarkable moments, is that super mutants are sterile. The FEV process destroys the reproductive systems of the organisms it converts. There is no future for a civilization built on FEV mutation, only the gradual decline of a population that cannot replace itself. When the Master is confronted with this reality, he breaks. Not violently, not with defiance, but with what can only be called grief. He acknowledges the flaw, he processes what it means for everything he has built and believed, and he destroys himself. It is a moment of genuine tragedy in a game that is often darkly funny, and it works because the Master was not designed as a villain who wanted bad things. He was designed as an intelligent being who arrived at a catastrophically wrong conclusion through a chain of reasoning that seemed internally coherent, and who was capable of acknowledging the error when it was demonstrated to him. That capacity for self-correction is presented, quietly, as something worth respecting, even in a creature that is also objectively a monster. The wildlife of the wasteland, the rad scorpions and mirelurks and cazadores and bloatflies and brahmin, and all the rest, tells a story about what 2 centuries of uncontrolled radiation and biological weapons releases and FEV contamination does to an ecosystem. It is not a subtle story. It is told in claws and venom and the particular hollow sound that a deathclaw makes when it starts moving toward you through the ruins. But it is a coherent story, with an internal logic that rewards attention, and scattered through it are details that gesture toward a richer picture than any single playthrough reveals. Section 7. Hidden Messages, Easter Eggs, and the Things the Developers Left Behind. There is a long tradition in game development of slipping things into finished products that most players will never find. Little acknowledgments, private jokes, references to things that only mean something to the specific team of people who built the world you are exploring. Bethesda and the previous Fallout developers at Black Isle and Obsidian have been particularly generous with this tradition, and the Fallout series is full of hidden signals and strange details that sit just below the surface of the normal gameplay experience. The Fallout universe acknowledges, quite freely, that it owes enormous debt to a specific literary tradition. The original game's creative director, Tim Kaine, and his team at Interplay drew heavily on mid-century American science fiction, particularly the strand of that tradition that concerns itself with the social consequences of technology, the fragility of civilization, and the peculiar optimism of the 1950s dream, meeting the reality of the nuclear age. Authors like Richard Matheson, whose novel I Am Legend is one of the most obvious touchstones, and Walter M. Miller Jr., whose A Canticle for Leibowitz explores the cycle of technological knowledge being accumulated and lost and accumulated again across centuries, shaped the foundational mythology of the Fallout universe in ways that are visible on close inspection. The Brotherhood of Steel's philosophy of knowledge preservation, for instance, reads almost directly as a riff on the Albertian order in A Canticle for Leibowitz, a monastic organization that survives a nuclear catastrophe by becoming the custodians of pre-war knowledge, copying and preserving documents that the surrounding population cannot read or understand, waiting for a future in which that knowledge will be useful again. Miller's monks and Maxon's knights are doing essentially the same thing, motivated by the same combination of genuine intellectual reverence and institutional defensiveness. Matheson's influence is visible in the Fallout 4 detail that the sole survivor is named the last hope of humanity by the Minutemen, a resonance with the last human protagonist of I Am Legend who believes themselves to be fighting to restore the world and discovers, in the final pages of that book, that they have become a myth to the society that has already replaced them. The sole survivor carries a similar ambiguity. Are they saving the Commonwealth? Or are they a relic of a pre-war world being used by the various factions of a post-war one to serve purposes that have nothing to do with who they actually were? H.P. Lovecraft provides the explicit reference in the Dunwich storyline, which spans multiple games and builds one of the most elaborate hidden narratives in the series. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is one of those locations that rewards extreme patience with its documentation. Deep in its sublevels, in a chamber called the Virulent Underchambers, there is a stone obelisk that hums with something that is not describable in ordinary engineering terms. Characters who encounter it respond to it in ways that are difficult to explain through ordinary psychology. A man named Hamey, whose audio logs can be found throughout the building, documents his gradual obsession with something he calls the obelisk and the entity it appears to represent. His final recordings are fragmented, desperate, and end in a way that implies something that the game never shows directly, which is somehow worse than if it had. The entity appears to be called Ugqualtoth, and by the time of Fallout 4, the Dunwich Borer's Quarry in the Commonwealth expands this mythology significantly. The quarry's terminals document a marble mining operation that experienced a series of deeply unusual events, workers reporting visions, a company management that seems to have known about the entity connected to the site and deliberately suppressed information about the disturbances while continuing operations, workers who descended to Station 4 at the bottom of the quarry and never returned. The visions that the player character experiences while exploring the lower levels of Dunwich Borers are pre-war flashbacks memories, apparently, of ritual ceremonies conducted at this site long before the bombs fell and long before the quarry was built, which implies that whatever lives in the deep levels of the Dunwich location predates the Great War entirely, predates Vault-Tec and the Enclave and West-Tec and all the other entities whose plans and failures made the wasteland what it is. Something was there before the world ended. Something is still there now. Fallout 76 introduces the Interloper, a giant creature at the bottom of Lucky Hole Mine, surrounded by stone faces that are identical to the ones found at Dunwich Borers. The faces are too specific to be coincidental. They represent the same sculptural tradition, the same iconography, the same worship of something that is never fully named across any of the games it appears in. The Dunwich thread is one of the most consistently developed mysteries in the franchise, and it is entirely possible that none of it will ever be resolved. It might be designed to be permanent background radiation, something that makes the wasteland feel like it has a depth that cannot be fully surveyed, a darkness at the bottom of things that the player can approach but cannot reach the end of. The mysterious stranger is another piece of permanent mystery, handled with more lightness but no less deliberate ambiguity. Appearing in every Fallout game from the original through Fallout 76, this figure in a fedora and trench coat materializes briefly during combat, fires a single devastating shot from a distinctive revolver, and vanishes before anyone can get a clear look at him. The game's official guide for Fallout 3 describes him as an odd and eldritch entity, which is a fairly significant characterization for what appears, on the surface, to be a lucky coincidence mechanic. The New Vegas detail that the lonesome drifter may be his son is handled with exquisite lightness. The drifter says his father was mysterious, a stranger to his own family. The dialogue options available line up the words mysterious and stranger in a way that is too deliberate to be accidental. The drifter carries a .44 Magnum with the same distinctive sound signature as the mysterious stranger's weapon. Nick Valentine, the detective synth of Diamond City in Fallout 4, has an open case file on the mysterious stranger that has produced no leads. His in-game reactions when the stranger appears and disappears are those of a professional confronting a mystery that genuinely baffles him, and Nick Valentine does not easily baffle. The mysterious stranger, as confirmed by the Fallout 2 build where the character appears female, appears to be a role rather than a specific individual, or perhaps something that transcends individual identity in ways the Wasteland doesn't have good vocabulary for. He appears to people in desperate situations. He removes obstacles. He asks for nothing. He is described in various guides and official materials as a guardian angel with a very large gun. And the phrase is meant to be slightly funny but lands more strangely than that when you think about it for a moment. Angels, in the traditional sense, are not biological beings. They are presences, functions. The mysterious stranger might be exactly what the description implies. The theory that the lonesome drifter is the mysterious stranger's son has accumulated so much circumstantial evidence across so many games that the franchise must be aware of it and is choosing, deliberately, to maintain the ambiguity rather than resolve it. The drifter says his father was a mysterious man. The word mysterious appears directly above the word stranger. In the available dialogue options, a line break that is too pointed to be unintentional. The Drifter's 44 Magnum has the same distinctive guitar chord sound effect as the mysterious stranger's weapon. The Drifter is a traveling performer who wanders the Mojave playing music and being generally harmless, and his backstory raised essentially without a father, by a mother who died when he was young, making his way alone across the wasteland with only his music and his gun, has the specific quality of someone who inherited a lot from someone who was barely present. Whether the mysterious stranger was ever present in any literal sense for the Drifter is not established. What is established is that the stranger operates in the wasteland without apparent physical limitation, appearing in places separated by thousands of miles in the same general time frame, which implies either that there are multiple people playing the same role, or that the stranger is not subject to the ordinary constraints of travel and location that govern everyone else. Nick Valentine's case file notes that the stranger's appearances have been documented across the entire post-war period, not just since Fallout 3's events, but going back decades further. If there is a single individual behind the mysterious stranger, they are extremely old. If there are multiple individuals, they have been coordinating across a very long time and a very wide geography with a consistency that implies something organizational. The Miss Fortune character in New Vegas, a woman who appears under similar circumstances to the mysterious stranger but causes unpredictable, chaotic effects rather than precise, lethal ones, adds another dimension to the mystery. She is associated with bad luck rather than good marksmanship, but she functions in the same structural role, appearing briefly during combat, affecting the outcome, disappearing. Whether Miss Fortune and the mysterious stranger are connected, whether they represent different aspects of the same phenomenon, or whether they are entirely separate mysteries that happen to share a structural similarity, the game declines to specify. The Mojave is large enough to contain mysteries that do not need to be connected to each other, and perhaps the stranger and Miss Fortune are simply two separate answers to the question of what kind of presence looks out for the people it watches over. There are developer signatures hidden throughout the Fallout games that do not reach the player through any normal channel. In-jokes about the development team. References to personal relationships and private experiences that meant something to specific people who built specific rooms. The wasteland is full of this invisible layer of authorship, the accumulated personal residue of hundreds of people who spent years of their lives building a world that would be played by millions and remembered by very few of those millions in any way that acknowledged the humans who constructed it. The Fallout series' relationship to its own literary debts is one of the more interesting aspects of the developer layer in the games. The original Fallout was designed partly as a tribute to a specific tabletop RPG called GURPS that the developers had originally planned to license before the deal fell through, and the influence of tabletop gaming culture with its traditions of collective world-building and player-driven narrative is visible throughout the franchise, in the openness of the moral systems and the refusal to insist on a single correct reading of the world's events. The games trust players to disagree with each other about what happened and what it means and who was right, because tabletop RPG culture has always known that the best stories are the ones people argue about afterward. Chris Avellone, who wrote enormous amounts of the lore that defines the post-Fallout 1 universe, particularly the Fallout Bible documents and the New Vegas content, has spoken in various interviews about the experience of writing for a world that other people built and that had already developed fan communities with strong opinions about what was canonical and what was not. His approach was to treat the contradictions in the existing lore as features rather than bugs, evidence of a world complex enough that no single account fully captures it, the way the real world is too complex for any single account. The mystery around the Great War, the ambiguity about various factions' true histories, the unresolved threads in the Dunwich storyline, these are partly the result of deliberate authorial choice to leave space, and partly the result of the organic complexity of a world built by many people over many years without a single controlling authority over every detail. The developer room in Fallout 3, accessible only through console commands, buried deep below the Capitol building, in a location that has no in-game path, contains a collection of objects and items that serves as a testing and debugging space. It also contains, like most Bethesda developer rooms, a few personal touches from the people who built it. Small items with specific names, references to things that mattered to specific team members. The way that game developers leave traces of themselves in places they assume nobody will ever look is a very specific form of graffiti. The assertion of presence in a context where presence is otherwise invisible, the creative equivalent of a worker carving their initials into the underside of a table. Fallout New Vegas contains a specific reference to the Interplay developers who created the original Fallout games, the Black Isle Studios team, whose work defined the franchise's foundational mythology in the form of a memorial to a group of developers who were let go before Fallout 2 was completed. The memorial is small and tucked away in a location most players never visit, but it is specifically and deliberately placed. The Obsidian team who made New Vegas were largely the same people who had been at Black Isle: Fergus, Urquhart, Chris Avallone, and others, and the memorial is an act of institutional memory, a recognition that the history of the franchise is also the history of the people who built it, and that history includes losses and endings as well as creative triumphs. The Pip-Boy 3000 appears in every mainline Fallout game from Fallout 3 onward as the player character's interface device, and its design went through extensive iteration before reaching its final form. The specific combination of chunky retro-futuristic industrial design and the specific green screen color became so associated with the Fallout brand that the Pip-Boy became a standalone product, a physical replica, available for purchase, and eventually the subject of its own mobile application. The device's in-universe history, documented in terminal logs and Vault-Tec promotional materials, describes it as a Vault-Tec product issued to every Vault resident, designed to track health statistics and serve as a general-purpose computing device in the event of post-war reconstruction. What the Pip-Boy actually is, from a lore perspective, is a surveillance device. It tracks everything the wearer does. It records locations, encounters, combat statistics, and item inventories. It is a real-time monitoring system that Vault-Tec designed to collect data from every Vault resident simultaneously, feeding information back to whatever monitoring infrastructure survived the war that the experiments were running on. The player character carries this surveillance device through the entire game. It is literally attached to their wrist without thinking about this aspect of its design, because the game never prompts you to think about it. The Pip-Boy is framed as a helpful tool, and it is a helpful tool. It is also a data collection device for an organization that treated its users as experimental subjects. The cheerful interface, the pleasant Vault Boy icons, the friendly readouts of health and damage and inventory, all of it is the same aesthetic as the Vault promotional materials. All of it is Vault-Tec making the instrument of observation feel like a convenience. But occasionally something from the authorial layer rises to the surface in ways that transcend the institutional frame. The Nuka World DLC's theme park sections contain visual jokes that are clearly the work of specific people having fun. The bobblehead placements in Fallout 4 reward exactly the kind of systematic completionism that developers tend to develop through years of building and testing games. The little graves and memorials and diary entries scattered through every Fallout game are the places where the people who made the world let themselves be a little more present than the game's official voice usually allows. These hidden layers are, in their own way, one of the most purely human things about the Fallout series. A world ostensibly about the aftermath of the worst thing that human civilization ever did to itself is also a world built by people who made inside jokes and left personal touches in corners that most players would never see. That tension between the grand tragedy of the lore and the ordinary human act of making something together is part of what makes the wasteland feel habitable, even at its darkest. The people who built this world cared about it. That caring is in the walls, in the objects, in the specific quality of light in specific rooms at specific times of day. You can feel it even when you cannot see it, especially then. Section 8. The Children of Adam and the God in the Radiation. There is a particular type of theological ingenuity in the Children of Adam's central doctrine, the kind of ingenuity that arises when people are trying very hard to make sense of circumstances that are By any ordinary measure, insane. Imagine you are a person in the Fallout wasteland. The world was destroyed by atomic bombs. Radiation covers everything. The environment that is supposed to support life is instead, in most places, actively hostile to it. How do you make meaning out of this? What story do you tell yourself about why the world is the way it is and what your relationship to it should be? Most wasteland communities make meaning by pointing at the pre-war world and saying that it was wrong, that its excesses and its failures produced the catastrophe, and that the task of the present is to rebuild something better. The children of Adam made a different choice. They looked at the radiation that fills the world, and they said, "This is God. This is not a punishment. This is a presence. And our task is not to clean it up or endure it or escape it, but to embrace it." The Church of the Children of Adam describes radiation as the glow, the visible manifestation of a divine being called Adam, who they believe is the creator of all worlds and the force behind all change. Their theology is built on the idea that what Adam does is divide, that matter itself is a process of division, that the energy released in nuclear fission is God acting in the world, that the bomb craters and irradiated zones that most people avoid are in fact sacred spaces where Adam's presence is most concentrated. Their ultimate eschatological vision is something they call the Great Divide, an event of cosmic nuclear fission so complete that it separates all things into their component parts, which they believe is a form of transcendence rather than destruction. This is, on its face, absolutely unhinged theology, and the game treats it with a complex mixture of mockery and respect that mirrors the complexity of the actual phenomenon. Because the children of Adam are not simply delusional, they are responding, in a very human way, to a very specific problem. They are living in a world where the structures that normally generate meaning, stable communities, predictable futures, comprehensible cause and effect, have been destroyed. They need a framework. They have built one. The framework is wrong, by most definitions of wrongness, but it is coherent on its own terms, and it produces a community that has genuine solidarity, genuine ritual, genuine care for its members. The theology has an internal elegance that rewards taking seriously even when you disagree with its conclusions. The observation that nuclear fission releases energy through division of matter is scientifically accurate. The extension of this into a cosmological principle that division is the fundamental creative act, that the universe itself is the result of original matter, dividing into its current complexity, is not scientifically supported, but it is not incoherent as a framework. And the leap from cosmological principle to ethical imperative, we should embrace radiation because it is the expression of the creative force of the universe, is no more logically strained than the equivalent leaps in many mainstream religious traditions. The children of Adam have done something genuinely interesting. Theologically, they have taken the specific horror of the pre-war world's worst technology and converted it into a framework that gives their community a reason to exist in the landscape that technology created. The children of Adam first appear in Fallout 3, in Megaton. Their founding figure in that area, Confessor Cromwell, arrived in Megaton as a young man and built a community of worshippers around the live, unexploded atomic bomb that sits in the center of the settlement. Cromwell is not presented as a fraud or a cynical manipulator. He genuinely believes what he preaches, and the people who follow him genuinely find something in the community he builds protection, meaning belonging in a world where belonging is extremely difficult to come by. The Megaton bomb itself, a small nuclear device that survived the Great War intact and ended up, through whatever chain of events, embedded in the ground at the center of a growing settlement, is one of the more remarkable objects in Fallout 3's world. It is large enough to be physically imposing. It is surrounded by a pool of radioactive water that glows with the children of Adam's sacred glow. It is not detonated, which means it represents both real threat and sacred presence simultaneously, both the thing that destroyed the world and the thing that could destroy this particular piece of it at any moment. The settlement of Megaton is built around this bomb, the way pre-war cities were built around their central squares and plazas and monuments. The bomb is the center. Everything else is arranged around it. This is either a profound act of theological world-building or an extraordinarily risky urban planning decision, and the settlement's residents managed to hold both readings simultaneously. By Fallout 4 and the Far Harbor DLC, the children of Adam have expanded from their capital wasteland origins into new communities across the Commonwealth and onto the fog-covered island of Far Harbor off the coast of Maine. The Far Harbor chapter housed in a decommissioned nuclear submarine they call the nucleus, is more theologically aggressive than the Megaton community ever was. Their leader, Confessor Tectus, does not want to wait for the Great Divide. He has the submarine's nuclear arsenal potentially available to him, and is actively developing plans to accelerate the Great Divide himself through deliberate detonation. The Mother of the Fog remains one of the more genuinely unresolved mysteries introduced in the Far Harbor DLC. She appears to guide the player character through the island's dangerous fog, manifesting as a semi-translucent figure who moves ahead and beckons onward. The children of Adam regard her as a divine messenger, one of Adam's most favored servants, given the ability to move through the deadly radiation of the fog without harm, and to communicate Adam's will to the community. But the material evidence on the island suggests she might be something rather more human. There is a house near where she appears containing mundane supplies, stealth boys, Rataway, a note with ambiguous but specific language. There is a hermit who has been leaving written observations around the island for what appears to be a long time, whose voice sounds like someone who has been watching and is tired of watching and is not sure what role, if any, they are supposed to be playing. The most interesting fan reading of the Mother of the Fog is that she is an ordinary person who has been, for reasons of her own, playing a role for the children of Adam, giving them the divine messenger figure their theology required, shaping the community's development in particular directions, perhaps trying to moderate the more destructive impulses of leaders like Tectus. Whether this is what the game intends is not confirmable, but it is a reading the evidence supports, and it is more interesting than either of the obvious alternatives: genuine supernatural entity or simple hermit who happens to move through the fog effectively. A person who has chosen to become a myth for the benefit of a community that needed a myth is a more Fallout story than either of the clean options. By the time of Fallout 4 and the Far Harbor DLC, the children of Adam have spread from the capital wasteland to the Commonwealth, and then further north to the island of Far Harbor, a fog-covered, radiation-drenched location off the coast of Maine that is about as close to a paradise as the children's theology can imagine. There, in a decommissioned naval submarine they call the Nucleus, a faction of the children has established itself under the leadership of a confessor named Tectus, who is significantly more aggressive about the Great Divide than any previous leader. Tectus does not just want to wait for the Great Divide, he wants to cause it. He has access to the submarine's nuclear arsenal, and he is actively working toward a detonation that would irradiate the entire island. The Far Harbor storyline is one of the most genuinely morally complex sections of Fallout 4, precisely because it does not present any of the island's factions as simply right or wrong. The children want to irradiate everything. The Far Harbor human community wants to push the radiation back and reclaim the island for normal habitation. The synths of Acadia just want to be left alone. And the player character has to navigate between these positions without a clear ethical compass pointing the way, because all three groups have genuine grievances and genuine stakes in the outcome. There is a mystery embedded in the Far Harbor DLC that has never been fully resolved, and that may be intentionally unresolvable. The Mother of the Fog, a figure who appears to guide the children of Adam and who is regarded by them as a divine messenger, may or may not be a physical person. There is a house on the island near where she sometimes appears, containing stealth boys and Rataway and ambiguous notes. There is a hermit who leaves writings in various locations on the island. Some players have argued that the Mother of the Fog is this hermit, a normal person who has been manipulating the children for reasons of her own. Others have argued that the evidence points towards something genuinely inexplicable. The game provides enough detail to sustain both readings and resolves neither. What the children of Adam represent in the broader Fallout universe is one of the most persistent threads in the series' thinking about religion. The games consistently present religious belief as a response to extreme circumstances, a tool for generating community and meaning in conditions that would otherwise make community and meaning impossible. They do not present this dismissively. The wasteland is full of people who have turned their survival strategies into sacred narratives, and the games treat this with consistent, quiet respect for the human need that drives it. Whether Adam is real is never answered. Whether the Great Divide is possible is never answered. What the children of Adam are building toward remains, in every game they appear in, a horizon that can be approached but not reached, which may be, in the end, the most honest thing the Fallout universe has to say about faith. It points towards something it cannot prove is there, and the pointing is the part that matters. Section 9. Ghost Towns, Lost Lives, and the stories left behind. One of the most quietly devastating things about the wasteland is what it preserves. 200 years of abandonment has not erased the pre-war world. It has pressed it like a flower between pages of history that nobody is reading. In every ruined building, in every cracked parking lot, in every submerged basement slowly filling with groundwater, there are objects that were where people put them and never retrieved. A pair of reading glasses on a nightstand. A half-finished crossword puzzle in a newspaper that still holds together because the radiation has actually slowed the usual decay. A child's shoe. The Fallout games build their most affecting moments not through cutscenes or voice dialogue, but through environmental storytelling. The careful placement of objects and bodies and documents that, when read in sequence, reconstruct events that no one in the present-day wasteland has witnessed or recorded. You are the audience for stories that have no other audience. You are the only person who will ever know what happened in this specific room. Springvale is one of the first examples in Fallout 3, a small cluster of ruined houses outside Megaton that, when explored carefully, reveals a portrait of an ordinary suburban community in its last days. A woman's diary in one of the basements runs from normal domestic entries through entries that track the news of the war approaching, to increasingly frightened entries about what to do, where to go, whether the vault will actually take them, and then to silence. The diary does not have a final entry. The woman who wrote it stopped writing at some point, and the wasteland does not tell you whether she made it into the vault or did not make it at all. Greyditch, a burned suburb in the southern part of the capital wasteland, is structured around the mystery of what happened there. There is a boy still alive in the ruins, traumatized and alone. His father is gone. The buildings are burned. There are fire ants everywhere, specifically fire ants that can project flames from their abdomens, which is not normal fire ant behavior. Finding out what happened requires locating the father's research notes, which document an experiment in FEV-enhanced insect aggression that went badly wrong in ways the father initially did not recognize as wrong. He was trying to solve a problem. He solved it in a way that created a much larger problem, and the settlement he was trying to help was the collateral damage. This pattern repeats across the games with remarkable consistency. The wasteland is full of people who had an idea and pursued it without fully thinking through the consequences, or who thought through the consequences and accepted them because the alternative seemed worse, or who simply ran out of options and made the best choice available from a menu of terrible ones. The pre-war world made this decision on a civilizational scale. The wasteland keeps making it on a personal one. Point Lookout, a DLC for Fallout 3 set in a creepy, fog-drenched Maryland swampland, is structured almost entirely around the archaeology of forgotten history. The Dunwich connection is there, in the swamp folk who worship the same entity documented in the Dunwich building. But beyond that, Point Lookout is a layered story about a resort community that decayed slowly even before the war, about families whose wealth and isolation produced a kind of inbreeding of both genetics and ideology, about the way that communities cut off from broader civilization develop strange customs to fill the space where shared culture used to be. The swamp folk are frightening. They are also, in the way that the best Fallout antagonists always are, comprehensible. They are what happens when people adapt to circumstances that were never supposed to be adapted to. The Devlin and Madeline story in Fallout 3 is one of the most complete and most affecting micro-narratives in the series. Found through a series of terminals in a post office building, it documents the relationship between two people who were in the building when the bombs fell. A postal worker and a member of the public who happened to be there for a mundane reason. They survive the initial blast. They barricade themselves in. Over the days and weeks that follow, as it becomes clear that the world outside is not recovering and help is not coming, they develop a relationship that the terminal entries document with a kind of careful restraint, the emotional reality of two people who are each other's entire world, by necessity first and then by choice. The entries end before the story does. The reader fills in the gap. In Fallout New Vegas: The Divide, the setting of the Lonesome Road DLC is one of the most atmospheric locations in the series for precisely this reason. The Divide was a settlement. It was actually becoming something, a community, a hub of trade and travel, a place that people were choosing to be rather than ending up in by accident. And then it was destroyed, in a way that the DLC gradually reveals was connected to the courier character's own history. The ruins of what the Divide was trying to become carry a specific quality of grief that Empty Wasteland does not. This was not just abandoned. It was interrupted. The Sierra Madre, another New Vegas DLC location, is a casino that never opened. Its pre-war owner, Frederick Sinclair, built it as a gift for a woman he loved, a complex, self-sustaining facility designed to outlast the war he believed was coming. Intended as a place where the people he cared about could survive indefinitely. The facility did outlast the war. It outlasted everything. By the time the player character arrives at the Sierra Madre, it has been running autonomously for 2 centuries. Its AI caretaker, a construct called Christine who Sinclair designed with elements of the woman he loved, preserving a building that has long outlived any reasonable purpose. The tragedy of the Sierra Madre is not just that its original occupants never made it. It is that the building kept doing its job anyway, out of a loyalty that is indistinguishable from love and equally divorced from reality. The Sierra Madre's cloud, the toxic vapor that fills its exterior spaces and kills unprotected visitors, is another example of a pre-war safety measure that outlasted the context that made it a safety measure. The cloud was designed to protect the casino and deter intruders. It was designed for a world in which the casino's value was clear and the intruders were criminals or competitors. In the world that actually exists 200 years after the casino was sealed, the cloud is protecting nothing from nobody, maintaining the perimeter of a building whose contents have long since lost any context that would make the protection worthwhile. The cloud, like the AI caretaker, like the vending machines that still dispense goods to holders of Sierra Madre casino chips, is a system that kept functioning because it was built to keep functioning, in the absence of any mechanism for recognizing that the world it was built for had ended. The abandoned shack near Vault 81 in Fallout 4, which contains the secret entrance to Vault 81's research facility, is one of the smallest and most overlooked locations in the game, but contains terminal entries that are worth reading carefully if you have time. A scientist's private log, kept during the operation of the Vault 81 experiment, documents not the research itself, but the researcher's gradually mounting anxiety about what the research required. The log does not name what the researcher was doing. It describes the weight of it. It describes the difficulty of going home to a normal life in the vault after the hours spent in the research facility. It describes the day the researcher made the decision to sabotage the experiment. And it ends, not with resolution or relief, but with the observation that the decision had been made and could not be unmade, and that living with the decision was going to be its own kind of thing. This is the texture of the Fallout universe at its best, not the grand events, not the faction conflicts, not the lore about FEV and the Enclave and the Generation 3 synths, but the individual, private, unnamed experience of being a person inside all of that. The researcher in Vault 81 is not a major character. They have no name in the games. They appear in a log entry, documented their moral crisis in private, and presumably lived and died inside Vault 81 without anyone knowing what they had done or what it had cost them. And the evidence of their existence, a few paragraphs in a terminal, somewhere in the bowels of the Vault's secret facility, is as complete a portrait of a specific human experience as any named character in the series receives. This is what the ghost towns of the wasteland are full of. Not just abandoned buildings and ruined infrastructure, but the residue of individual human experiences that had no audience and left no record except the specific and personal documents that the buildings have been preserving, more or less accidentally, for 2 centuries. The wasteland is an archive of private lives, and exploring it carefully is an act of witnessing, of making present, if only to yourself, something that was private and then abandoned and then preserved by the very catastrophe that abandoned it. The Museum of History in Fallout 3 carries a specific quality of irony about what it means to preserve things. It is a pre-war institution designed to keep historical artifacts safe and contextualized, whose purpose was to help visitors understand where they came from and how the present connected to the past. By the time the lone wanderer explores it, it is occupied by ghouls, many of them former humans who have been alive long enough to be, in a meaningful sense, living historical artifacts, and the institution of the museum, the building and its contents, has become an artifact of the pre-war world rather than a curator of artifacts. The museum is now part of what it was designed to document. The containers have become the contents. The radio broadcasts that play throughout the Fallout games create a haunting quality of continued presence. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is the most famous, a pre-war radio personality who survived the war and is still broadcasting from the ruins of a DC studio, still playing songs from before the war, still commenting on events in the wasteland with the same energy and format he would have brought to a normal radio career in a world that no longer exists. Mr. New Vegas in Fallout. New Vegas is even more uncanny. He appears to have been either killed before the game begins or is broadcasting from a recording, and the show runs without his awareness of anything that has happened since its last live episode. These broadcasts play into the silence of the wasteland like sounds from another dimension, voices from a world that ended carrying themselves unchanged into a world that replaced it. The note to Billy in Fallout 4, found in the ruins of a suburban Massachusetts neighborhood, is a short document written by one child to another, making plans for a sleepover that was never going to happen. The note is not significant to any quest. It has no gameplay function. It just sits on a desk in a house full of skeletons, a record of the ordinary texture of a day in October 2077 that ended before those plans could be executed. This is the environmental storytelling the Fallout games do at their best, the small, unmissable detail that opens into something much larger if you let it. Billy was probably in school when the bombs fell, or at home, or somewhere that is now rubble. The plans were made in good faith, the way children make plans, assuming that the future would accommodate them. The future did not accommodate them, but the note is still there. Every ghost town in the wasteland is a question about what survives and what does not. The buildings survive, mostly. The objects survive sometimes with a fidelity that is almost more disturbing than decay, the radiation having acted as a kind of preservative, keeping the artifacts of the pre-war world in a condition that makes the absence of the people who use them more rather than less legible. The documents survive, fragmented but readable. What does not survive in any form that resembles its original state is the social fabric, the relationships, and the conversations and the shared understanding that made a place meaningful rather than simply physical. The wasteland preserves the evidence of communities without preserving the thing that made the evidence matter. And the player character, moving through that evidence, is the presence that temporarily restores the connection, the reader who makes the unread diary meaningful, the witness who makes the undocumented event documentable. Section 10. The Great War. What really happened? The 23rd of October 2077. 9:47 in the morning, Eastern Time. 2 hours. That is how long the Great War lasted. 2 hours of nuclear exchange between the United States and China that managed, in that brief window of time, to do more damage to the human world than everything that had come before it in recorded history. The clocks in the Fallout games are stuck at 9:47, not everywhere and not always legible, but often enough that it has become one of the most recognizable visual details of the series. The moment frozen in the clock face, the before and after dividing at a specific hour on a specific day, and everything after that moment being the wasteland. What actually caused the Great War is one of the great unanswered questions of the franchise, and it has been answered in different ways by different sources at different times, and the answers do not always agree. The most straightforward version, supported by the testimony of Fallout 2's President Richardson and by various terminal entries in Fallout 4, is that China launched the first nuclear strike against the United States after a decade of grinding conventional warfare in Alaska, and the American mainland had reached a stalemate that neither side could break. China, facing military defeat after American forces, backed by experimental power armor, pushed their troops out of Anchorage and began advancing on Chinese territory, made the decision that a nuclear exchange was preferable to conventional loss. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of the franchise, has said in interviews that his vision for the Great War always involved China striking first, motivated specifically by fear of the forced evolutionary virus. The FEV research being conducted by West Tech and the American military was not secret from China's intelligence services. From China's perspective, watching their adversary develop a pathogen that could theoretically convert the entire human population into something else, something that was no longer Chinese, no longer bound by any pre-war national allegiance, something that could be directed the calculus of a preemptive nuclear strike, might have looked very different than it does from the outside. And then there is the Vault-Tec theory, which the Amazon Prime series elevated from fan speculation to something closer to canon. In the TV series, The revelation that Vault-Tec itself may have been responsible for the first nuclear detonation is presented as the conclusion of an investigation conducted by a pre-war character and then by various parties across the show's narrative. The logic runs something like this. Vault-Tec had invested enormous resources in building vaults that were specifically useful in the event of a nuclear war. The experiments planned for those vaults required a war to start and seal populations inside the vaults before the populations could learn what they were really in for. A Vault-Tec that had prepared this extensively for a war had a very specific interest in that war actually occurring. This theory gains additional weight from what we know about Vault-Tec's corporate structure and relationships. Vault-Tec was not just a defense contractor. It was embedded in the upper levels of the American government in ways that are not fully mapped out in any single source. The company's operations were protected by the new amended Espionage Act, which was not incidental. The act protected them specifically from journalistic or legislative oversight that might have exposed what they were actually doing. A company with that level of protection is a company that has powerful friends, and powerful friends in the Fallout universe tend to have large plans. The Chinese submarine in Fallout 4, accessible through a quest involving its ghoulified captain, is one of the more affecting pieces of the Great War's story. The submarine, identifiable by its hull type and its presence off the coast of Boston, was almost certainly one of the weapons that destroyed the city. The captain, Zhao, who has been alive in some form ever since, can express genuine remorse about following the orders that led to the destruction of a city full of people he had never met and had no personal quarrel with. He followed his orders. He did what soldiers do, and the world that resulted from the aggregate of many decisions like his, some on the American side and some on the Chinese side and some apparently on the Vault-Tec side, is the wasteland. The 2-hour duration of the Great War is one of the details that takes on more weight the longer you sit with it. 2 hours is not very long. 2 hours is a film, a long dinner, a commute for someone who lives far from work. In 2 hours, enough nuclear material was delivered to enough targets across enough of the continental landmass to produce a world that is still radioactive 2 centuries later, still populated by the creatures that emerged from that radiation, still being governed by institutions whose entire reason for existing traces back to the events of those 2 hours. The efficiency of it is almost impossible to comprehend from a human scale. The world ended before most of its inhabitants understood that ending had begun. The Fallout Shelter mobile game includes a detail that gets very little attention but is strangely affecting. The moment a nuclear attack begins on the Vault's region, the loading screen shows the Vault Boy with his characteristic thumbs up and grin, and the caption reads, "The end of the world." The cheerfulness is the point. The aesthetic of the Fallout universe insists on cheerfulness in the presence of catastrophe, not because the people in it are stupid or in denial, but because the pre-war world specifically cultivated cheerfulness as a response to anxiety, and that cultivation worked so thoroughly that the aesthetic persisted into the catastrophe itself. The Vault Boy is still grinning at the end of the world because the Vault Boy was designed to grin at everything, and no one had time to redesign him before the world ended. The clocks in the Fallout games are set to 9:47. They are stuck there. This is a choice that could have been made differently. The developers could have left the clocks at whatever time a particular building's occupants had last adjusted them, producing a variety of frozen moments rather than a synchronized single one. The choice to synchronize them, to make 9:47 a constant across the wasteland landscape, converts the stopped clocks from a realistic detail into a symbol. Every clock in every location marks the same moment. The world did not end in different places at different times. It ended everywhere at once. And the clocks record this synchrony with the precision of a device that was designed to track time and can no longer do so but cannot forget the last moment it managed. The Anchorage Reclamation Memorial, accessible through the Operation Anchorage DLC, is one of the stranger monuments in the franchise, a memorial to a military victory that preceded the end of civilization by only a few years, preserved and honored in a virtual reality simulation by a group of Brotherhood of Steel soldiers who may have been in that simulation for longer than any of them would admit to acknowledging. The simulation was designed to train Brotherhood members in the tactics of the Anchorage campaign, but some of the soldiers in it have been running the simulation for so long that the boundary between training, exercise, and reality has become less clear than military discipline would prefer. There is something almost meditative about the way the Anchorage simulation loops the same campaign, the same landscape, the same victory, running over and over in the absence of anyone who needs to be trained by it. The Great War lasted 2 hours and changed everything for a minimum of 2 centuries and possibly forever, depending on how you read the more pessimistic corners of the lore. It is presented in the games not as a mystery to be solved, but as a wound to be examined, and the examination never fully heals it because the point is not resolution. The point is the continued living with it, the continued presence of the stopped clocks, the continued question of who made the decision and why, and whether it could have gone differently. In the Fallout universe, as in the real one, the answer to that last question is always yes, and always not in any way that changes anything now. What the Great War establishes, as the foundational event of the Fallout world, is that civilization is not a permanent condition. It is a project, maintained by the continuous effort of people who choose to maintain it, and it can fail in very specific and preventable ways if the wrong choices are made at the wrong times by the wrong people. The wasteland is what happens when that project fails, and the entire Fallout series, all the factions and vaults and ruins and characters and music and atmospheric detail, is built on the question of whether the project can be started again and what it would need to look like the second time to have any chance of not ending the same way. The resource wars ended because the resources ran out. The Great War ended because there was nothing left to destroy. The question that haunts the whole franchise is whether the thing that comes next will find a way to do what the pre-war world did not, to recognize the edge before it reaches it. Section 11, Time Anomalies, Supernatural Events and Things that Defy Explanation. The Fallout universe is careful about the supernatural. It provides most of its monsters with rational, materialist explanations. Radiation and FEV did this, military experiments did that, corporate negligence produced the other thing. But running alongside and underneath the materialist explanations is a current of something that the franchise has never fully committed to explaining, a quality of weirdness that resists reduction to science, no matter how creative the science. The Dunwich entities are the most obvious example, already covered in their own section, but there are others, smaller and stranger and more difficult to categorize. Mothership Zeta, the DLC for Fallout 3 that plants the player character in an alien spacecraft, is the most explicit supernatural element in the series and also the most contested. Bethesda put it in the game. Many players and commentators feel it represents a significant tonal departure from what the rest of Fallout does. Whether alien abduction is too far for a series that already includes sentient deathclaws and brain-collecting automatons and reality-altering drugs is a question worth sitting with. What is genuinely interesting about Mothership Zeta, from a mystery perspective, is not the aliens themselves, but the suggestion that the alien presence in the Fallout universe is not a new thing. The ship contains humans who were abducted across a significant span of human history, some of them clearly pre-war, some of them ancient. Whatever the aliens are, they have been watching and collecting for a long time. The Psychic Nullifier, an item that appears in Fallout New Vegas, is a stranger detail than it first appears. The item's description suggests that it was developed to block psychic signals, which implies the prior existence of psychic signals worth blocking, which implies the existence of psychic abilities in the Fallout universe. There is scattered evidence of this across several games, characters described as unusually perceptive in ways that go beyond normal human capacity, certain locations that seem to affect the cognition of nearby individuals in systematic ways. Whether this adds up to a consistent hidden mythology of psi powers is not clear, but the details are too numerous to be entirely coincidental. The visions at Dunwich Borers, which the player character experiences involuntarily while exploring the deeper levels of the quarry, are presented as memories, specifically, as the player character's access to memories of events that occurred at that location long before their own lifetime pre-war ceremonies, pre-war rituals, pre-war interactions with whatever the Dunwich entity is. There is no mechanism given for how these visions work. They simply happen. In a universe that is otherwise very interested in explaining how things work, this absence of explanation is itself a kind of signal. The Gauss rifle in Fallout 3 emits a thunderclap-level sound when fired and leaves a crater. The Lincoln Memorial, in the same game, contains a ghost of Lincoln that exists only as a holographic echo, a recording that has outlasted any reasonable expectation of its power source. The Tranquility Lane simulation in Fallout 3 is a virtual reality environment that has been running for decades inside the head of a single elderly man who trapped his neighbors inside a dream to prevent them from forcing him to wake up. Within the simulation, a character called the Troublemaker exists, a behavioral modification system that has developed enough autonomy to suggest to the player character that everyone inside the dream has been dead for years, and that the simulation is running on memories that are being maintained by something the simulation itself does not fully understand. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 is one of the most atmospheric locations in the series, an extraordinarily irradiated zone south of Boston where the nuclear detonations were dense enough to produce a landscape that is still actively emitting radiation at levels that will kill an unprotected human in minutes. The glowing sea contains things that are difficult to explain as simply the product of 2 centuries of radiation, specific light quality, sounds that are present in certain areas for no identifiable source. The Children of Atom settlement in the crater of Atom, built around one of the original impact zones, has an atmosphere that feels genuinely different from other locations in the game. Heavier, quieter, the radiation glow in the air less like light and more like attention. There is a moment in Fallout 4, near the Nahant Oceanological Society, where the coastal fog and the low light and the scattered remnants of what was once a scientific facility combine to produce something that is less a game location and more of a feeling. The researchers whose terminals you can read were studying marine life that had changed in ways they found increasingly difficult to categorize. The things they were finding in deeper water did not match anything in their pre-war reference materials. Whether this points toward genuine supernatural weirdness or simply toward the thoroughness with which FEV and radiation had altered the ocean ecosystem is left unresolved. The terminals grow increasingly nervous in tone and then stop. Time in the Fallout wasteland is strange in ways the games acknowledge obliquely. Ghouls who have been alive since before the war carry their pre-war identities into a present that is almost unrecognizably different. The Pit's antagonist, Asher, is a Brotherhood paladin from the Capital Wasteland chapter who arrived in Pittsburgh decades before the events of the DLC and built an industrial operation there that has its own internal history and mythology. The sole survivor in Fallout 4 is a pre-war individual experiencing the post-war world as a newcomer, someone who has no lived context for how things got the way they are, only the evidence of what they find around them, and the fragmentary accounts of people whose parents and grandparents lived through the transition. The Tranquility Lane simulation in Fallout 3 is one of the franchise's most quietly disturbing locations, structured around a premise that would be horrifying in a more theatrical way if it were not presented with such deadpan domestic ordinariness. An elderly scientist named Stanislav Braun, formerly head of Vault-Tech's Special Experiments Division, has been living in a virtual reality simulation for over 200 years. He populated the simulation with the other residents of Vault 112 before placing them all in VR pods and has been running what amounts to a simulated neighborhood, with himself as its architect and god. He has, over the course of 2 centuries, enacted every possible variety of cruelty on his simulated neighbors, killing them, resetting the simulation, rearranging the social order, inventing scenarios specifically designed to generate maximum misery out of what appears to be pure boredom. The actual people in the pods are still alive, technically, their bodies sustained by the pod systems, while their minds live in Braun's simulation. When the player character enters Tranquility Lane, they enter a 1950s neighborhood rendered with the specific quality of something that has been running for too long without maintenance, slightly off in its details, slightly wrong in its light quality, populated by characters who have the exhausted affect of people who have been actors in the same play for 200 years and have long since forgotten why the play was supposed to matter. The neighborhood is cheerful in the way that Vault-Tech's promotional materials were cheerful performatively, insistently, in a way that has become its own form of horror. Braun has built a machine for generating suffering inside a machine designed to simulate safety, and the gap between the 2 machines is where Tranquility Lane actually lives. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 rewards extended attention in a way that combat-focused exploration does not encourage. If you approach it slowly, walking rather than running, stopping to look at the landscape without an immediate objective in view, it has a quality unlike anywhere else in the game. The radiation is high enough to register as a constant pressure. The light comes from below as much as from above, because the irradiated ground itself emits a faint luminescence. The Children of Atom settlement in the original impact crater has a stillness that is different from the stillness of abandoned locations. It is inhabited stillness, the quiet of a community that has made its peace with where it lives. And the deeper craters, where the bombardment was densest, have an atmosphere that resists easy description. They have been fundamentally altered, not just on the surface but in some quality of their presence in the world. The Far Harbor Islands fog is another location that rewards slow attention. The fog is lethal to most characters without protection. It reduces visibility to almost nothing. It makes the island's geography feel contingent, and unstable paths that exist in clear conditions simply do not exist in the fog, because the fog does not reveal them. And inside the fog, sounds carry differently. There are sounds in the Far Harbor fog that have no obvious source, and that the game does not explain or comment on. They may be environmental design creating atmosphere, they may be something else. The game declines to specify, which is the correct choice. All of this produces a universe in which time does not feel entirely stable. The past is too present. The stopped clocks, the preserved objects, the ghouls who remember the world before everything conspires to create the feeling that the wall between what was and what is has been made porous by the event that destroyed the old world. The Fallout universe did not just change history, it is still living inside the consequences of that change, in ways that have not fully resolved 2 centuries later. The glowing sea is still glowing. The fog is still thick. The Dunwich entity is still at the bottom of its quarry. The mysterious stranger is still appearing and disappearing in the middle of firefights, helping in ways that ask for nothing, vanishing before anyone can get a clear look at him. Some things in the wasteland are very old. Some of them were old before the wasteland was the wasteland. And they will be old long after whatever comes next has risen and fallen and been replaced by something the current wasteland cannot imagine. Section 12. The Survivor. Who are you really? Every Fallout game presents you with a character who is, in some respects, a blank. The Vault Dweller of the original game, the Chosen One of Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, the Courier of New Vegas, the sole survivor of Fallout 4. In each case, you are playing a character who has a history, or the fragments of one, and then walks out into a world that does not know them, and that they must understand from scratch, through the evidence they encounter, rather than through prior knowledge. This structure is not just a mechanical convenience, it is a thematic statement. The Fallout universe is specifically interested in the question of what kind of person survives a civilizational collapse and what they do with that survival. Every player character is, in the end, an answer to a question the Wasteland keeps asking. Given everything that has happened, what are you going to be? The Vault Dweller's story is the most straightforwardly heroic of the major player characters, and even there the heroism is complicated by what it costs. The player character of Fallout 1 saves their vault, saves the broader region from the Master's army, and is then exiled from the community they saved because their presence is considered disruptive. They have become too large for the world they came from. The places that were small enough to belong to before the adventure started are no longer small enough to hold them. This is a very old story, the returning warrior who cannot re-enter civilian life, because civilian life has no container for what they have become, and Fallout 1 tells it without softening it. The Chosen One of Fallout 2 deals with a more specifically family-inflected set of expectations. They are sent out to save their tribe, their people, their community, carrying the weight of obligation that comes from being chosen rather than merely competent. The game is interested in what happens when the weight of being chosen meets the reality of what needs to be done to fulfill that obligation, and the answer involves a great deal of moral compromise and a final confrontation with an organization that had decided essentially that the Chosen One's entire community should not exist. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 is perhaps the most emotionally legible of the player characters, because their story is built on the most universal possible foundation, a child looking for their father. James, the Wanderer's father, is a scientist whose work on Project Purity eventually becomes the central conflict of the game. The mystery of why he left Vault 101 and what he was working toward, and what his relationship to his child is supposed to be beyond simply progenitor and origin, occupies the emotional core of Fallout 3 in ways that the game sometimes acknowledges and sometimes elides. James is a good man trying to do something genuinely good, and his good intentions are not enough to protect him or the people around him from the consequences of the world he has walked into. The Courier of Fallout, New Vegas, is the most deliberately enigmatic of the player characters. Shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave at the beginning of the game, the Courier spends the entire story reconstructing what happened to them and deciding who they want to be in response to it. The game is unusually explicit about the courier's prior history. Various characters have heard of them, worked with them, have opinions about them, but the player never gets direct access to that history. You are meeting yourself through other people's memories, which is a disorienting experience that the game exploits beautifully in the Lonesome Road DLC, where the courier must confront someone who knows them as well as they knew themselves before the bullet. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 is uniquely positioned among the player characters because they actually remember the pre-war world. They lived in it, they went to sleep in it, and woke up in its ruins. Their experience of the wasteland is specifically that of someone who is looking at the debris of a world they actually inhabited, and the psychological weight of that recognizing the places, understanding the context for the ruin in a way that someone born into the wasteland cannot, is something the game handles with uneven, but often genuine care. The mystery at the center of Fallout 4 is the question of who Sean really is, and what the Institute has done with him, and what the right response to that reality is. But underneath that mystery is a deeper one. The sole survivor is not just a person in search of a missing child. They are a pre-war person attempting to navigate a post-war world with a set of values and assumptions that were forged in the world that no longer exists. The thing they want to return to, the life, the family, the neighborhood, the context, is gone in every meaningful sense. What they find instead is a world that needs their pre-war competence without being able to offer any of the things the pre-war world offered in return. What does a person owe a world they were not born into, but only deposited in by circumstance? What do they owe the factions that want to recruit them, each of which has a coherent argument for why their vision of the future is the right one? What do they owe the child they set out to find, who has become an old man with a vision of the future that is not compatible with any obvious notion of family? These questions do not resolve cleanly, and none of the game's endings provides a version of resolution that does not require significant sacrifice or compromise. The courier's experience of identity in Fallout New Vegas is more fractured than any other player character, because the game begins with the courier having already been someone and having lost access to that someone through the act of being shot and left for dead. The other player characters begin at the beginning of their journey and accumulate identity through it. The courier begins after an interruption and spends the whole game trying to understand what the interruption means and who they are in its aftermath. The Lonesome Road asks this question most directly. Who were you before the bullet? And is that person the same as the person who survived it? And does it matter? Ulysses, the antagonist of the Lonesome Road DLC, knew the courier before the game begins. He has strong opinions about who they were and what they did, and what those things mean. And he arranged the courier's return to the Divide specifically to have this confrontation, to force the courier to stand in the place where the consequences of their past actions are most visible and account for them. The courier can respond in various ways, can make various arguments about responsibility and intention, and what accountability actually requires. But the confrontation itself is inescapable. The courier cannot be whoever they want to be in relation to Ulysses, because Ulysses already knows who they were, and the courier does not have equivalent knowledge to counter with. This is the most philosophically interesting version of the identity question the Fallout series poses, because it suggests that the freedom the player has to define their character is not absolute. The wasteland has a memory. Other people have memories. The things the player character did before the game began, which the player never directly experiences and can only reconstruct from other people's accounts, are part of who the courier is, in a way that the player's choices going forward cannot simply overwrite. You can change what you do next. You cannot change what you did. The courier's pre-game history is fixed and external, and comes back to confront them in the person of someone who was shaped by it. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 raises a different version of the identity question. They have their pre-war memories intact. They remember who they were before 2077. They remember their spouse and their child and their neighborhood, and the specific quality of the morning when the bombs fell. The problem is not that they have lost access to their pre-war identity. The problem is that they have been separated from it by 200 years of physical absence and the complete transformation of the world in which that identity was formed. The person they were is clear in their memory. The world that person belonged to no longer exists. The challenge they face is not recovering a lost self, but finding out what the self they have becomes when the world it was built for is gone. Father, the elderly institute director, who is also Sean, the sole survivor's infant child, grown up in the absence of his parents, is the most painful version of this problem. The reunion the sole survivor has been working toward is real. in the sense that Sean is genuinely their child, and genuinely the person who was taken from Vault 111 as an infant. But it is also not real in the sense that the child and the old man are not the same person in any way that the sole survivor's emotional preparation for this reunion could have anticipated. Sean did not grow up with parents. He grew up in the Institute, raised by an organization that was using his DNA as the foundation for its most ambitious project. He has complicated feelings about the parents he never knew. He has not resolved those feelings, and the sole survivor does not have enough time with him to help him resolve them. The Fallout 4 endings all involve loss of some kind. The Brotherhood ending requires the destruction of the Institute and, in most interpretations, the Railroad. The Institute ending requires the destruction of the Brotherhood and the Railroad. The Railroad ending requires the destruction of the Institute and the alienation of the Brotherhood. The Minutemen ending requires the destruction of the Institute and a kind of ongoing presence in the Commonwealth that the sole survivor has to maintain indefinitely. None of these endings restores what was lost. None of them brings back the pre-war world, or the family or the morning in October that the sole survivor still remembers, with the clarity of someone who fell asleep in it only yesterday. What every player character in the Fallout series ultimately shares is the experience of being defined by something they survived. The Vault Dweller survived leaving the Vault. The Chosen One survived, being chosen by a community that did not have great options. The Lone Wanderer survived the discovery that their father was human and fallible and did the best he could, and it was not enough. The Courier survived being shot in the head and buried and left for dead. The sole survivor survived 200 years of frozen sleep while everyone they knew aged and died around them. These are defining survivals, not just things they lived through, but things that made them specifically who they are rather than someone else. And in each case, the game asks what that survival means and what the person who survived is going to do with it. The Wasteland does not offer comfort. It offers complexity. It offers situations that require decisions, and the decisions have consequences, and the consequences ripple outward through the world in ways the player character can observe but cannot fully control. This is, finally, what the Fallout series has always been interested in, not the catastrophe, though the catastrophe is richly rendered, but what the people who survive the catastrophe decide to do in its aftermath. Every mystery in the franchise is ultimately a version of this question, encoded in a holotape or a terminal log or a faction's founding ideology. What do you do when everything falls apart? What do you become? What do you build? The answers are all different. That is the point. Section 13. The FEV and the many forms mutation takes. There is a through line connecting almost every major threat in the Fallout universe that runs underneath the surface of the various faction conflicts and regional politics and personal storylines. That through line is a single piece of biotechnology developed in the years before the Great War by a defense contractor called West Tech, at the direction of the United States government, with the stated purpose of developing biological superweapons for the Sino-American conflict. The Forced Evolutionary Virus FEV is present in so many of the Wasteland's most significant features that understanding it is something close to understanding the Wasteland itself. FEV began as a solution to the New Plague, the disease that swept through American cities in 2053, killing significant numbers and prompting a public health crisis. West Tech was contracted to develop a biological response. The research that resulted started as genuine vaccine and treatment work before, at some point in the mid-2050s, being redirected by military funding and military objectives toward a very different application. The new goal was not a cure for disease. It was the creation of enhanced human soldiers who would be resistant to biological warfare agents, physically superior to baseline human, potentially capable of sustained combat effectiveness in environments that normal soldiers could not survive. The results of FEV research, scattered across the world of Fallout, represent almost every possible outcome of the basic process of forcing rapid evolutionary change on an organic system. Super mutants are the most visible result organisms whose human origin is still legible in their basic form, but who have been altered to a degree that places them in a different biological category entirely. The West Coast variants, produced by the Master's operation at Mariposa, are the most refined expression of what FEV can do when it has a clear goal and a relatively clean input. Large, long-lived, disease-resistant, sterilized by the transformation process, intellectually variable across a wide range with a small percentage reaching or exceeding human cognitive capacity. The East Coast variants produced at Vault 87 are a rougher expression, same general form, significantly lower cognitive ceiling, more purely aggressive in their baseline behavior. The difference is the FEV strain. The Vault 87 strain was a less developed version of the Mariposa FEV2, and the organisms it produced reflect this in their reduced cognitive complexity. The Appalachian supermutants encountered in Fallout 76 represent yet another variation, produced from the Huntersville contamination experiment, where West Tech introduced an FEV strain into the water supply of a small West Virginia town and watched the results. The Huntersville mutants are in some respects intermediate between the West Coast and East Coast populations, and their existence predates the Great War, which means there were super mutants in Appalachia before the bombs fell. This is a detail that tends to get overlooked but is worth sitting with. The super mutant problem was not created by the nuclear war. The nuclear war accelerated and spread it by destroying the containment facilities and releasing populations of modified organisms into environments that had no prior experience of them. But West Tech was already producing super mutants before October 2077. The people of Huntersville were already transforming before the bombs fell. The forced evolutionary virus was already part of the world's biological landscape before the catastrophe that the Fallout games are nominally about. In a meaningful sense, the FEV problem is not a consequence of the Great War. It is a precondition for it, one of the many threads of pre-war hubris that the Great War amplified rather than created. The Institute's use of FEV for Generation 3 synth development represents the most sophisticated post-war application of the virus, and also, in some ways, the most disturbing, because it is not being used to transform humans into something other than human. It is being used to create something that is human, from scratch, for purposes that include, but are not limited to, replacing specific humans with synthetic copies. The Generation 3 synths are the only FEV product in the franchise that are designed to pass as unmodified human. Everything else FEV touches becomes visibly, obviously different. Generation 3 synths become invisible, indistinguishable from the people they are built to replicate or the communities they are built to infiltrate. The Enclave's modified FEV curling 1-3, designed to kill anything carrying radiation-induced genetic mutations, represents the most deliberate weaponization of the virus's original purpose. Where West Tech designed FEV to create super soldiers, and the Master used it to create an army, and the Institute used it to create workers and infiltrators, the Enclave turned it back toward its most fundamental capability, the ability to target specific genetic configurations and destroy anything that carries them. FEV curling 1-3 is not a mutation driver. It is a precision deletion tool designed to eliminate a specific subset of the human genome by killing every organism that carries it. The Master's use of FEV deserves its own extended consideration because Richard Gray, the human researcher who became the Master through an accidental FEV exposure at Mariposa, represents the most philosophically sophisticated of the virus's effects on human cognition. His exposure did not merely transform his body. It transformed his cognitive capacity in ways that made him simultaneously more and less human. More in the sense that his processing power and his ability to integrate information from disparate sources increased dramatically, eventually reaching a point where he could sense the thoughts of individuals in his proximity and absorb them into his distributed consciousness. Less, in the sense that the frame of reference that organized his cognition, the one that told him what the right goals were and what it felt like to care about other people, was altered by the transformation in ways he may not have fully been aware of. The Master is one of the few villains in the franchise who was genuinely trying to help. He had looked at the wasteland, at the survivors, scratching out miserable existences in the ruins of a civilization, prey to disease and violence, and the radiation that filled everything. And he had concluded that the problem was biological fragility. That baseline humans were not equipped to survive in the world that the war had created, and that FEV offered a path to creating humans who were. The super mutant form, as the Master designed and optimized it over years of controlled experiments in the Mariposa vats, was stronger than baseline human, more resistant to radiation and disease, longer lived, capable of surviving in environments that would kill a normal person quickly. From the Master's analytical perspective, the case for conversion was sound. The only flaw in it was the one the player character can expose, that super mutants are sterile, that the conversion process destroys reproductive capacity, that a civilization of super mutants is a civilization with an expiration date and no children. When this flaw is demonstrated to the master through a combination of evidence and argument that the player character can provide in dialogue, the master does something remarkable. He does not rationalize. He does not double down. He processes the information with the same analytical capacity that had constructed his plan and reaches the same conclusion that an honest analyst would reach: that the plan does not work, that it cannot work, that the future he was building has no future in it, and that he has caused enormous suffering in the service of a dream that was fatally flawed from its foundation. And then he ends himself and his army and his operation at Mariposa in a decision that is simultaneously logically consistent and genuinely tragic. The Huntersville contamination in Fallout 76 provides a different angle on the FEV story, the one where the experiment is not run by a visionary trying to build something, but by a company trying to meet a contract. Westech introduced FEV into the water supply of Huntersville, a small town in West Virginia, in February 2076. They told the town they were installing a new sewage and water treatment system. They did not tell the town that the new system would be introducing a mutagenic virus into the water they drank. The first symptoms looked like a flu outbreak. Westech told the town it was a rare but manageable strain and sent in personnel to monitor, not to treat, to monitor. By the time the changes were clearly not influenza, the town was under company guard and nobody was getting out. The Huntersville experiment is different from the Vault experiments in a specific way. It was run on a community that did not consent even to entering a controlled environment. Vault residents made a choice, however uninformed, to go into a vault. The people of Huntersville made no such choice. They were living in their town, doing their ordinary lives, and a defense contractor introduced a biological agent into their water supply because a government contract required data, and their town was the most convenient location for generating that data. This is the pre-war world's most casual cruelty, not the dramatic evil of the master or the cold institutional evil of Vault-Tech's experiments, but the bureaucratic evil of a company ticking a box on a research mandate without particularly thinking about the people the tick mark was costing. The Wasteland's relationship with FEV is ultimately a relationship with the question of what biological identity means and who gets to define and modify it. The pre-war world decided, through its defense contractors and its government laboratories, that biological identity was a resource to be exploited, that organisms could be redesigned toward specific ends, that the line between natural and engineered was a technical obstacle rather than a moral boundary. The Wasteland is living with the consequences of that decision in the bodies of every super mutant and every Generation 3 synth and every feral ghoul and every radiation-altered creature that populates its landscape. FEV did not create the Wasteland, but FEV made the Wasteland significantly stranger and more dangerous than nuclear war alone would have, and more alive, in its way. The creatures of the Wasteland are not simply casualties of the pre-war world's worst impulses. They are its ongoing legacy, thriving in the ruins of the world that created them, adapting and reproducing and building their own versions of what comes next. Section 14. Music, Atmosphere, and the Sound of the End of the World. There is something about the Fallout soundscape that requires its own examination, because the music and the ambient sound design of these games do something that is quite specific and quite remarkable. They make the end of the world feel livable. They make the ruins feel inhabited in a way that goes beyond the presence of other characters. They make the stillness of the Wasteland feel like a kind of companionship rather than a kind of loneliness. The original Fallout games used licensed music from the period Ink Spots, Louis Armstrong. Bing Crosby played through in-game radio systems and heard as ambient background in settlements and on Pip-Boys. The choice was not simply nostalgic, it was specifically and carefully tonal. These songs were not written for the Wasteland. They were written for the world that became the Wasteland, the pre-war America that the Fallout universe depicts in its cheerful, slightly sinister promotional film aesthetic. Hearing them in the context of crumbling buildings and radiation glow and 200 years of accumulated catastrophe does something specific to the listener. It makes the distance between what was and what is palpable in a way that description alone cannot achieve. Enon Zur's scores for Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76 take a different approach, composing original music that has the quality of the wasteland's silence rather than the quality of the world that preceded it. Zur's Fallout 3 score in particular is extraordinarily effective at creating the specific emotional texture of exploring a beautiful ruin long, slow orchestral pieces that have something almost meditative about them that give the Capital Wasteland's destroyed cityscape a kind of grandeur that the experience of walking through real ruins sometimes achieves, and that most games do not manage. The music does not comment on what you are seeing. It coexists with it. It is the sound of a world that has been quiet for a long time and has developed its own kind of beauty in that silence. The ambient cave sounds in the Fallout games, the strange creaks and distant drips and occasional inexplicable sounds that trigger when you have been underground for a certain amount of time, are one of the franchise's most consistently effective atmospheric tools. They do what ambient sound in caves is supposed to do. They make the space feel larger and less knowable than it is. Every cave in the Fallout games has the quality of having more extent than the map reveals. The sounds suggest corridors that the game does not show you. The sounds suggest presence without identifying what presence. This is the same basic effect that drives the Dunwich entity's mysterious quality, the suggestion of something that cannot be directly perceived, but that the sensory environment consistently implies. The radio stations in Fallout, New Vegas, operate across a political spectrum that mirrors the factional conflicts of the game's main story. Radio New Vegas plays pre-war music with a host whose voice has the quality of someone who has been performing for a room that does not change. Mojave Music Radio plays a different selection. Enclave Radio, still broadcasting from some remnant transmitter somewhere in the Mojave, plays martial music and political speeches from a government that has been functionally destroyed. Mr. New Vegas may be a pre-recording running on an automated system that has been running since before the war. The in-game documentation is ambiguous about this, which means the cheerfulness in his voice when he wishes. Listeners, a good day in the Mojave might be the cheerfulness of a person who does not know that the world ended. Or it might be a performance, maintained for 2 centuries, for an audience that the system has no way of knowing still exists. The music in Fallout 4's Diamond City Radio, broadcast by a man named Travis Miles, who begins the game with crippling social anxiety and ends it if you complete his optional questline with genuine confidence, is one of the smaller and more human arcs in a game full of much larger ones. Travis is not brave in any operatic sense. He is a man who is afraid of the microphone and gets behind it anyway, every day, because someone needs to do it and he is the person available. His voice changes over the course of his storyline in ways that are genuinely affecting. He becomes more comfortable with his own presence. He stops apologizing for existing. And the music that plays behind his voice, the pre-war songs, the same ones that have been playing in the wasteland since before the war ended, sounds slightly different when it is being introduced by someone who is learning, in real time, how to be a person in public. The Inkspot song that plays at the beginning of Fallout 4 Into Each Life Some Rain Must Fall, playing over the opening monologue and the first pre-war glimpse of the sole survivor's neighborhood, is one of the most specifically chosen pieces of music in the franchise. The song is about hardship that is distributed equally across all lives. It is about the inevitability of suffering, delivered in the sweet, sad harmonies of a genre that turned suffering into something beautiful. And it plays over images of an ordinary suburban morning in a world that is about to end. The combination creates a feeling that is specific and difficult to name, something between grief and wonder, the awareness of beauty being held in the same moment as the awareness that beauty is about to be destroyed. Bethesda's music director Nathan Perkypile and the various composers who have worked on the series have spoken about the challenge of scoring a world that is simultaneously sad and wondrous, a place where terrible things happened but where the result is not simply terrible. The wasteland is genuinely beautiful in places. The way the sunset catches the ruins of a city that used to be a city, the way a settlement at night, lit by improvised lights and campfires, has an intimacy that the pre-war city it is built in the ruins of never achieved. The way certain wastelands, the Mojave Desert in New Vegas particularly, have a quality of silence and space that is its own kind of peace, regardless of the violence that the setting implies. Enon Zur's approach to scoring the post-war wasteland is worth examining in some detail because it is genuinely distinctive from how most games score post-apocalyptic settings. The default approach to scoring apocalyptic landscapes is to use music that emphasizes either the loss, slow, mournful pieces that underline the tragedy or the threat tense, dissonant pieces that emphasize the danger. Zur does neither, or rather does both so simultaneously that neither dominates. His Fallout 3 main theme, which plays over the opening narration and over the main menu, is orchestral in a way that is simultaneously monumental and intimate. It takes its time. It does not rush toward its emotional destination. It creates a sense of space around the listener, a spaciousness that mirrors the experience of walking through an empty, ruined city at dawn. The ambient tracks that play in the open wasteland in Fallout 3 are largely non-melodic sustained tones and textures and distant, muffled resonances that suggest a landscape rather than commenting on it. They are the musical equivalent of the atmospheric perspective that makes distant objects look hazy. They create depth by being less specific than the foreground. Walking through the capital wasteland with the ambient tracks playing is an experience with a very specific quality. You are present in the landscape in a way that music usually prevents, because the music is itself the landscape rather than a commentary on it. The Fallout 76 score incorporates Appalachian folk music elements, fiddles and acoustic guitars, and the specific intervals of bluegrass harmony in ways that connect the post-war Appalachia of the game to the musical traditions of the actual Appalachian region. This is an unusual choice for a science fiction game, and it works because it creates a sense of genuine regional identity that the wasteland setting alone would not. The mountains of Appalachia have a specific character in American cultural imagination. They are old, they are insular, they have their own traditions and their own relationship to the wider country that surrounds them. The folk music elements in the Fallout 76 score invoke this character, placing the post-war wasteland in a geographic and cultural context that gives it depth beyond the generic post-apocalyptic aesthetic. This is, finally, what the music and the soundscape of the Fallout series are doing underneath their obvious function as atmosphere. They are insisting that beauty persists. That human creativity, the particular human impulse to organize sound into something that makes the passage of time feel meaningful, survives the worst things that humans do to each other and to the world. The wasteland is full of pre-war music, not just because the Fallout universe is built on mid-century aesthetics, but because the games are making a claim that the songs people made before the bombs still matter after the bombs. That the human need to make beautiful things and share them is not a casualty of catastrophe. It is one of the things that outlasts it. The ink spots are still singing in the ruins. The big band arrangements are still swelling over crumbling infrastructure. Music keeps going, because music was never really about the world that made it. It was always about the people listening to it, wherever they happen to be. Closing what the wasteland keeps. The Fallout universe is, in the end, a meditation on persistence, on what survives when everything else does not, on what people choose to carry forward from a world that ended, and what they choose to leave behind, and what they discover they were carrying without having chosen it. The stopped clocks persist. The Nuka-Cola machines persist, humming on their own power supplies, full of drinks that will never be collected by anyone who put money in them. The music persists, playing out of speakers that were installed before the war and have been broadcasting ever since. The propaganda posters persist on the walls of crumbling buildings, still insisting on a version of America that has not existed for 200 years. The Vault Boy persists, grinning from every surface, his cheerfulness impervious to the catastrophe that his company helped engineer. And people persist. This is the thing the franchise keeps returning to. People make terrible decisions and do terrible things and build terrible institutions and pursue terrible ideologies. And they also build communities in the ruins of other communities, and they keep fires lit in broken fireplaces, and they raise children in conditions that would seem impossible from the outside, and they make music, and they fall in love, and they argue about the best way to cook Brahmin steak, and they keep going. The Fallout universe is not optimistic about civilization exactly. It is too honest about what civilization is capable of doing to itself to be straightforwardly optimistic. The civilizations it depicts, the pre-war America, the post-war factions, the vault communities, all have the same basic shape, promising beginnings that curdle over time into something that prioritizes its own continuation over the values that originally made it worth continuing. Vault-Tec started as a shelter program and became a human experimentation network. The Brotherhood started as a technology preservation order and became an isolationist military cult. The Institute started as a scientific research community and became an organization that abducted and experimented on the surrounding population without their knowledge or consent. Every institution in the Fallout universe eventually becomes a version of itself that its founders would barely recognize and might not endorse. But the games are simultaneously and persistently optimistic about individuals, about the specific humans who make different choices within their institutions or outside of them. The Vault 81 scientist who sabotaged the experiment rather than hurt the people around him. Roger Maxson, who recognized what was wrong in the laboratory at Mariposa and chose to act on that recognition rather than comply. Owen Lyons, who read the Brotherhood's mandate as including an obligation to help the people around him even when the institution disagreed. The unnamed characters in terminal logs across every game who made small choices of decency in the middle of large systems of indecency. The Fallout universe is full of these people, and they are always there, always choosing, always making the small or large difference that changes something specific even when they cannot change the system. The mysteries of the Fallout universe are the places where this persistence meets something it cannot explain. The Dunwich entity is there before the people and will be there after them, an intelligence or presence or force that predates the pre-war world and has been receiving worship from various human communities since before recorded history in this universe. The mysterious stranger appears and helps and disappears, and no one knows why or how or what he is: a guardian, a function, a person, a myth that has developed enough reality to carry a weapon. The children of Adam pray to something that might or might not be listening, and build communities around that prayer that are real and meaningful regardless of whether the prayer is received. The Generation 3 synths wonder whether they are people and build lives on the assumption that they are, and the lives they build are indistinguishable from lives built by people who were never uncertain about their nature. The ghouls who remember the world before keep carrying those memories into a present that does not know what to do with them, and they keep going anyway, because they have been doing it for 200 years and they know how. There are also mysteries that the franchise has seeded and never followed up on in ways that the community is still working through. The Dunwich entity is the most developed, but there are others. The specific relationship between the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, introduced in Fallout 76, and the West Coast chapter that Roger Maxson founded is documented in fragments that do not fully cohere. The fate of the Enclave remnants scattered after the events of Fallout 3 is addressed in New Vegas, but not definitively resolved. There are Enclave members who were still alive during New Vegas's timeline, still carrying their convictions about genetic purity into a world that had moved past them, and the game suggests rather than states what becomes of them. The nature of the vaults that are still sealed, Vault 63, Vault 96 fully, and others remains an open question, because sealed vaults are, by definition, things the game cannot access without a sequel. The question of whether the Fallout TV series revelation that Vault-Tec started the Great War will be incorporated into game canon is one that the franchise has not yet answered. If it is incorporated, it changes the entire moral weight of the pre-war period in a way that the games had left deliberately ambiguous. If it is not incorporated, the series and the games occupy the same timeline while holding different truths about who started the war, which is its own interesting situation. The franchise has always been comfortable with multiple accounts of the same events, with the gaps between accounts being part of the texture of a world too complex for any single perspective to fully capture. None of these mysteries resolve. That is not a failure of the franchise. That is its most honest quality. The world it depicts is a world that contains things which cannot be fully known, alongside things which can be partially known, alongside things which are known and terrible, alongside things which are known and beautiful. It is, in this way, very much like the world we live in, only rendered in brighter colors and larger monsters and more dramatically stopped clocks. The Wasteland is honest about the limits of knowledge in a way that most fictional universes are not, because the catastrophe that created it specifically destroyed most of the documentation that would allow a complete account. The archives are gone. The institutions that maintained them are gone. What remains are fragments, and the fragments are enough to build a world from, and the world built from fragments is more interesting than a world built from complete information, because the gaps are where the imagination lives. Wherever you are as you hear this, whatever room, whatever hour, whatever particular weight the day has left you with, the Wasteland is there if you need it. Its ruins are patient. Its mysteries are persistent. Its music is still playing, 200 years after the world it was made for ended, over speakers that were never supposed to last this long. The Wasteland teaches something specific about the relationship between catastrophe and meaning, a lesson that the games themselves do not state directly, but that accumulates through the experience of playing them. The lesson is this: meaning is not a feature of circumstances. It is a decision made inside circumstances. The pre-war world had the material resources and the technological capacity to create meaning abundantly, and it used those resources to build Vault-Tec experiments and biological weapons programs and national debt and propaganda posters. The post-war wasteland has almost nothing, and inside that almost nothing, people build communities and make music and fall in love and decide that specific things and specific people matter enough to protect. The Fallout games do not romanticize this. They are too honest for romanticism. The communities people build in the wasteland are fragile. They are preyed upon by raiders and super mutants and well-organized factions with large resources. They collapse when their leadership fails or their water supply runs out, or a nearby vault experiment gets loose. The music people make is played over the ruins of the world that used to make music professionally and has left only recordings behind. The love people find is love in conditions that make love very difficult to sustain. None of it is easy, and none of it is permanent, but all of it is real. The community in Megaton, gathered around the bomb in their center, debating whether to detonate or disarm it while going about the business of ordinary life, they are real. The railroad operatives who give up safety and secrecy to help strangers because they have decided the strangers deserve the help, they are real. The caravanners of the Mojave, who move goods across dangerous territory because the alternative is settlements that cannot survive without trade, taking the risk of the road every day because the risk of the road is better than the certainty of stagnation, they are real. The scavengers who pick through ruins looking for something that can be repurposed, who bring home a functional pre-war lamp or a working radio and feel, briefly, the specific satisfaction of having retrieved something from the catastrophe and made it useful again, they are real. This is what the Fallout universe ultimately offers. Underneath all of its lore and its faction conflicts and its mysterious entities and its stopped clocks, an extended meditation on the durability of the ordinary. On the fact that people keep doing ordinary things, fixing things, cooking things, talking to each other, worrying about the same kinds of worries that people worried about before the world ended, even in conditions that would seem, from outside, to make ordinary life impossible. The catastrophe did not remove the human need for ordinary life. It made that need more visible by removing everything that usually distracts from it. And maybe that is the most Fallout thing of all. The things that were supposed to last did not. The institutions, the governments, the carefully constructed systems of authority and resource allocation gone. And the things that were not supposed to last are still here. The music, the instinct to help a stranger, the child's question that starts with why and does not stop until it reaches something that feels true. The person who looks at the ruins of the world and decides to build something in them anyway, these things persist. The wasteland is full of evidence that they persist. And that persistence, quiet and unheroic and absolutely ordinary, is the warmest thing in a cold landscape, and the truest thing the franchise has ever found to say. There are things about the Fallout universe that no amount of lore reading fully resolves, not because the developers were careless, but because they were thoughtful enough to build a world that resists simple summary. The question of whether synths are people is not answered. The question of whether the children of Adam are right about anything is not answered. The question of what the mysterious stranger is not answered. The question of whether the wasteland's various attempts at rebuilding civilization will produce something more durable than what they are rebuilding from is not answered. The franchise keeps these questions open because they are the right questions to keep open, because a world that has definitively answered them would be a world that has stopped thinking, and thinking is the one activity the wasteland consistently rewards. The people who built these games spent years of their creative lives in this world. They built rooms that would be visited by hundreds of millions of people and rooms that would be visited by almost nobody. They wrote diary entries for characters who would never have names in the credits. They designed the texture of irradiated mud at a specific time of day, in a specific season, in a specific region that most players would not distinguish from any other irradiated mud. They did all of this not because it was efficient, it absolutely was not efficient, but because they were trying to make something real. And making something real requires doing the parts that do not show as carefully as the parts that do. The Fallout universe is what results from that kind of care. It is a world dense enough to sustain years of exploration without exhausting its mysteries. It is a world honest enough about human nature to make its catastrophe feel inevitable without making its inhabitants feel hopeless. It is a world atmospheric enough to feel like a place rather than a setting, to produce the specific experience of returning to it after time away and recognizing the particular quality of the wasteland light, the particular cadence of the dialogue, the particular way a feral ghoul sounds when it notices you in the dark. If this has kept you company tonight, a like and a subscription are the simplest way to make sure the next journey is ready when you want it. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. The wasteland stretches pretty far, and it's good to know who else is out here in it. There is something genuinely comforting about knowing that in rooms and on screens across however many time zones, other people are sitting with the same ruins and the same music and the same stopped clocks, following the same threads through the same darkness, finding the same small warm things in the same cold landscape. Sleep well. The clocks are stopped, the music is still playing, and the wasteland will still be there when you wake up, patient and strange and full of things that nobody has found yet. War never changes. But the stories we tell about it carry us further than we expect. And some of those stories are still being told, 200 years after the world they describe came to an end. There are more mysteries in the wasteland than any single journey can find. More terminal logs unread, more grave markers uninspected, more holotapes lying in the dark waiting for someone to press play. The Fallout universe is deep enough that people have spent years in it and still come up with new questions, still find corners of the lore that gesture towards something not yet explained, still encounter the particular sensation of a detail that means something without revealing exactly what. If you want to keep exploring, there will be more. More history, more strange corners, more stopped clocks, more personal diaries, more quiet evidence of the world that was and the world that came after. Until then, wherever you are watching from, whatever the hour, sleep well, the wasteland will still be there. And if you found this worthwhile, a like and a subscribe cost nothing and mean quite a lot. It is the easiest way to find this again, and to make sure the next journey is waiting when you want it.